Hello. Tonight we are going to talk about how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights. And much, much more. Forget the shining castles, the glamorous banquets, the clinking of goblets you've seen in movies. Those belonged to maybe 0.5% of the population. The rest, the people who actually made the food, who actually froze their hands off pulling turnips from muddy ground, lived a very different reality. And it is their reality, damp and uncomfortable, but also weirdly resilient, that will keep you company tonight. Before we dive in, yes, I'm going to say the thing, if you like this kind of slow, meandering journey through the dust of the past, hit that little button, the one that makes you subscribe. It takes you less than a second, but it makes my nights slightly warmer than the poor farmer we're about to trap in his 12th century bed. And, well, click like too. It won't save you from the plague, but it might save this channel from disappearing into the abyss of forgotten algorithms. Now, let's get you comfortable. If you haven't already, turn off the lights. Seriously, lights off. Don't give me the excuse that your phone is already too bright. I know you're squinting at this screen while lying at a weird angle. Put the phone on the nightstand, adjust the blanket, stretch your toes like you're about to board a medieval ox cart for a 6-hour ride. Deep breath. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to till any soil. All you need to do is listen. And here's the fun part. By listening, you get to escape the central heating, the electric blanket, the hot shower you take for granted. Congratulations, you just signed up for drafty doors, straw mattresses, and nights where your nose freezes while your feet stew and sweat. Yes, welcome to history. It's not glamorous, but it's much harder to ignore than Netflix. Imagine the smell first, because that's what would hit you. The cottage is small, barely larger than your living room if you live in an apartment, or maybe just the size of your bathroom if you're spoiled. The walls are wattle and daub, a polite way of saying sticks smeared with mud. The roof is thatched, which means you share it with a family of mice and possibly one extremely bored owl. The air is thick with smoke from the fire that should keep you warm, but mostly just paints your lungs in gray. It smells like damp straw, like sheep, like turnip stew reheated too many times. You wanted medieval authenticity? Here, you can choke on it. The bed. Let's talk about that bed because you'll be spending a long night in it. It is a wooden frame, creaky in ways you didn't think wood could creak, stuffed with straw that hasn't been changed in weeks. Imagine lying on a sack of cornflakes that occasionally moves because yes, insects live there too. The blanket, if you're lucky, is wool. Scratchy, slightly damp, and heavier than any weighted blanket you've ever bought online. This is not cozy rustic charm. This is survival layered in fabric that smells faintly of the sheep it used to be. Now, if you think peasants went to bed alone in a dignified, Instagram-worthy way, let me ruin that image. Families often slept together in the same bed, or at least in the same room, because body heat was the only central heating. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes even the animals. You think your roommate's snoring is bad? Try falling asleep with a pig grunting at your feet and your brother stealing the blanket. Romance novels don't write about that. Outside, it is cold. And when I say cold, I mean the kind of cold that bites. Not, oh, it's brisk outside, better grab my sweater. I mean frost on the inside of the window if you had glass, which you don't. I mean cold that wakes you up at 3 a.m. just to remind you that yes, you are alive, but you're not sure if that's good news. Cold that stiffens your hands so much you can't untie your own belt if you needed to. Cold that makes time stretch until dawn feels like it will never come. But don't panic. We are not rushing. This is a bedtime story after all. So, take another deep breath. Feel the blanket around you, your modern, clean, probably machine-washed blanket, and compare it to what peasants had. They didn't complain much because they didn't have the option. You, however, can enjoy the contrast. So, here's where our story begins. You, lying there in straw, wondering whether the tiny itch on your leg is just a scratch or a flea settling in for a midnight snack. You're not royalty. You don't get feasts. You get barley bread and thin soup. And your main concern right now is surviving until morning without freezing, starving, or being robbed. That's the reality. That's the world we're going to walk through together tonight. Congratulations. You just woke up in the year 1325 in a damp little cottage somewhere in Northern Europe.
Morning comes, not because of a gentle alarm clock or the soft buzz of your phone vibrating under your pillow, or even because you set a Spotify playlist to wake you up with birdsong. No. Morning comes because the fire, which you thought would last the night, has burned down into nothing but ash. You wake up shivering. Your toes are frozen, your breath is fogging in front of your face, and the only soundtrack is the faint squeak of a mouse raiding your last crumbs of bread. Congratulations. You survived the night. Barely. The rooster crows. Yes, the cliché rooster. Only this one doesn't crow once, charmingly, like in a cartoon. He crows endlessly. He screams like an unpaid intern who knows his life is going nowhere, but louder, over and over. He doesn't care that you're tired, that you only managed 4 hours of restless half-sleep while your sibling elbowed you in the ribs and your father mumbled in his dreams. This is your alarm clock. And unlike your phone, there is no snooze button. You get up or you freeze. So you roll out of bed, or rather off the pile of straw you've been calling a bed, and your feet hit the dirt floor. It is not wood, it is not carpet, it is cold, uneven, damp earth. Mud, sometimes. You know how people now pay for earthing sessions, walking barefoot on soil to feel grounded? Congratulations! You get that every morning for free, whether you want it or not. Spoiler, you don't want it. Now, hygiene. This will be quick because there isn't much to say. You don't brush your teeth, not because you're lazy, but because toothbrushes don't exist. Mouthwash? Try rinsing with ale. Soap? Rare, expensive, often smells worse than the dirt it's supposed to remove. Your morning wash is splashing cold water on your face if the bucket by the door isn't frozen solid. And the bucket, by the way, was filled yesterday from the nearest stream, which is not exactly pristine Evian. Imagine washing your face in water that smells faintly of cow and despair. That's your skincare routine. Clothes are not fresh either. You don't have a closet. You have one set, maybe two if you're lucky. Wool, coarse, scratchy, smells like sheep. Always smells like sheep. You put it on even though you slept in it because why not? There is no concept of changing into clean clothes unless you're nobility. And you are not nobility. You are a human turnip. And turnips don't get wardrobe variety. Breakfast. Let's pretend this is exciting. Spoiler, it's not. Breakfast is yesterday's bread, if any is left. Bread that is rock hard because preservatives don't exist. Sometimes you soak it in ale to make it chewable. Yes, ale for breakfast. Don't get excited, it's weak. Barely alcoholic, basically liquid bread. Coffee? Not in Europe yet. Tea? Forget it. Juice? If you mean the watery dregs left in the bottom of a cider barrel, sure. Mostly it's bread, and maybe some porridge if there's grain. If you're lucky, there's a smear of lard or cheese so sharp it could probably peel paint. Bon appetit. And you eat quickly, because there's no time to linger. Dawn means work, and work doesn't wait. There's no working from home unless you mean working at home until your hands crack from cold. You don't check emails. You don't scroll Instagram. You don't even get to sit down for long because the animals need feeding, the fire needs relighting, and the field, always the field, calls. But let's stay a bit longer in this moment because stretching time is what peasants did best and also what I'm doing to keep you awake just long enough to fall asleep. You chew the bread, slowly. Every bite scratches the roof of your mouth because the millstones that ground the flour left tiny fragments of grit in it. Congratulations, you're basically eating edible sandpaper. Dentists don't exist, but don't worry, you'll grind your teeth down to the gums naturally by the age of 30. Efficiency. You glance around your one-room house. Smoke stains the ceiling, light creeps through the cracks in the door, and every crack is another draft of cold air slicing in. The animals are restless. The cow lowing, the pig snorting, the chicken scratching. They don't live outside. They live with you because their body heat helps warm the room. Yes, your living room is also a barn. You wanted a pet? Congratulations, you've got 12, and they're all farm animals, and none of them are house-trained. Your children, if you have them, are already awake, whining because they're hungry. Your spouse is muttering, trying to get the fire going again with damp sticks. The baby is crying. You think about complaining, then realize it wouldn't change anything. So you grab your bread, choke it down, and accept the fact that your day has already started, whether you wanted it or not. And here's the irony. In a way, medieval mornings were efficient. There's no choice paralysis, no what do I wear today, no should I order oat milk or almond milk. There is bread, there are chores, end of discussion. But efficient does not mean pleasant. It means relentless. You stretch your stiff arms, rub your face, and think briefly about the dream you had. Something about warmth, maybe, or food that wasn't boiled into tasteless mush. Dreams are better than mornings here, but you can't stay in them. Because outside the sun is rising, and your day in the mud is about to begin.
You step outside, the door creaks, the air bites, and your first thought is not poetic. It is not, the beauty of the dawn. It is, dear God, it's cold. The ground crunches beneath your bare or half-shod feet, because shoes, if you have them, are stiff leather that never quite fit. They are as waterproof as a sponge. If you don't have shoes, well, congratulations, nature is your footwear. The sun is rising, but don't imagine a golden Instagram sunrise over rolling hills. Imagine instead a weak, pale light that does its best but fails miserably. It reveals the mud, the frost, the dung gathered near the doorway. Yes, dung, because animals live with you and relieve themselves with enthusiasm. Medieval Europe, where every step outside your cottage is a gamble between slipping, sinking, or stepping in something warm you wish you hadn't. First chore? Animals. Always the animals. You start with the chickens, who don't care that you're tired. They cluck and flap and look at you with tiny eyes full of judgment. You scatter grain, if you have any, and check for eggs. Sometimes you get one, sometimes not. The egg is fragile, but it feels like treasure, because an egg means protein, and protein means you might not faint in the field later. Then the pig. The pig is smarter than you want it to be and hungrier than seems possible. It snorts, pushes, demands. You throw scraps into the trough, bread crusts, turnip tops, the things you wouldn't eat but still feel guilty giving away, because food is never plentiful. The pig doesn't care. It eats greedily, grunting like a monster. You briefly envy its enthusiasm. Then the cow, or goats if you're less fortunate. Milking is a daily ritual. Your hands are numb, the cow is impatient, and the milk is warm but foamy and often full of bits you don't want to think about. You collect it anyway. This is breakfast part 2, and maybe dinner as well. You'll boil it later, or churn it, or simply drink it, because options are for the rich. Now you head to the field. The field is your real master. Forget lords, kings, or God himself. The field commands you. The soil is frozen, clumpy, stubborn. You bend, dig, pull, push. Your back aches before you even begin because bending is your default posture. Tools? Wooden, heavy, blunted by time. Iron tips if you're lucky, but iron costs, and you are not lucky. Plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting. Depending on the season, the task changes, but the misery remains. Today, maybe you're digging turnips. Tomorrow, maybe barley. Next week, it's the same.
just colder. You sweat despite the chill, your hands blister, your nose runs, you wipe it on your sleeve because tissues don't exist. Welcome to productivity, 13th century style. Meanwhile, your neighbors are out too. Everyone is in the fields. It's not because of community spirit, it's because if you don't work, you don't eat. You nod at each other without enthusiasm. There is no cheerful good morning, just mutual acknowledgement of shared suffering. Imagine a modern office, but outdoors, freezing, with no coffee machine, no breaks, and no chance of quitting. Yes, it's like that, except the boss is the soil. And let's not forget the feudal lord. He owns the land. You just rent it, in the loosest sense. A generous portion of whatever you grow will go to him whether you like it or not. Taxes, tithes, dues, layers of obligation heavier than any load you carry. You work all day, and the best part of your crop doesn't even feed you. It goes up the chain to the man in the stone house on the hill who has more food than he can eat and more blankets than he can use. Think about that while your stomach growls. Medieval motivation at its finest. The hours stretch. You dig, you pull, you scatter seed, you curse quietly, you get mud under your nails that never washes out. The wind slices across the field. Sometimes it rains, making everything to sludge. Sometimes it snows, making work nearly impossible. But nearly impossible is not the same as optional. You keep going, because stopping means hunger, and hunger is worse than cold. At some point, you pause, not to rest is not a thing, but to shift tasks. Maybe you carry wood, maybe you mend a fence, maybe you walk to the stream to haul water in buckets that weigh more than your child. You stagger back, spilling half of it, only to be told you need more. Medieval life is basically one long, unpaid workout routine, with the added benefit of chronic malnutrition. Lunch, if you can call it that, comes late. Bread again, maybe some cabbage, maybe a thin stew. You eat it in the field, sitting on a rock, your breath steaming. You chew slowly, not to savor, but to stretch it out, because there isn't enough. You talk a little with whoever is nearby, but talk is limited. Words waste energy. And besides, what is there to say? How's the weather? Miserable. How's the harvest? Miserable. Conversation complete. Back to work. Always back to work. You wonder if the day will ever end. Your shoulders scream, your feet ache. You fantasize about sitting, about warmth, about food with flavor. Instead, you bend, you pull, you dig, you haul. And through it all, there is no sense of achievement, no promotion waiting at the end, no bonus, no recognition. The best you can hope for is survival. You will not be remembered. Your name will not appear in chronicles. At best, someone might find your bones centuries later and say, "Ah, yes, a peasant. That's your legacy. Feel inspired?" No, neither did they. The light begins to fade, but your work is not done. There's wood to chop, repairs to make, tools to clean. And so you trudge on, your body exhausted, your mind numb, your will bent but not broken, because you can't afford to break. Not yet.
Comfort is a rumor that drifts through the village like smoke. You can see it, you can smell it, but when you reach for it, it slips through your fingers and stains the ceiling instead. Your house does what it can, poor thing, which is to say, not much. You step back inside after the field, and the cottage exhales a breath that's mostly damp. The thatch above your head murmurs with tiny lives you did not invite, and every beam has its own opinion about groaning. The door never quite shuts. It prefers a relationship with the wind, an open marriage of drafts where your body is the third wheel. You shove a wedge under it, a bit of wood so old it remembers trees, and for 3 minutes the gap is smaller. Then the door sighs, and the cold slides back in, polite as a thief. You try the fire. It sulks on the hearth like a cat that refuses to stand. You feed it twigs stingily, because you do not own a forest, and your lord believes trees exist for his banners,
his ships, his mood. The smoke refuses to negotiate with the hole in the roof that is not a chimney so much as an opinion about chimneys. And instead of leaving, it loops back down and kisses your eyes. They smart. Tears aren't romantic here. They're just what smoke does to a face that has nowhere else to look. When the flames finally accept your pleading and rise, they will not rise high. They are a small rebellion with a small budget. You warm your hands at the meager light, and the skin prickles. Your knuckles are cracked, cross-hatched with little paper-cut lines that sting when you flex. The heat does not go deep. It is an actor playing warmth, but it is something. In the medieval arithmetic of comfort, a tiny fire minus a large cold equals survival, and survival is worth more than beauty. You take your wool cloak, the same cloak you wear in the field, inside the house, at church, at a neighbor's birth, at a stranger's funeral, and you pull it tighter. It does not become softer. It is forever sheep, forever a memory of rain. Your clothes carry the year like rings in a tree. The hem is stained where you have walked through seasons, and the elbows are thinned by prayers you said with your forearms against your knees. You have mended this tunic so often, it is more thread than cloth now, a patchwork of your own patience. The seams itch. The laces on your shoes, if today is a good day for shoes, bite into the swelling on your instep. You consider loosening them, then remember what the path outside looks like when it forgets how to be solid. The shoes stay tight. Your feet complain anyway, their complaints muffled by callous and duty. Water is a daily ambition. The bucket by the door is never empty enough or clean enough, and the bottom always tells the truth about the path from the stream. Bits of leaf, a whisper of silt, the occasional flake of bark that managed to hitch a ride. You skim it with 2 fingers hardened by every other task and pretend that is purification. You pour a little into a wooden bowl whose rim is a map of teeth marks, and you wipe your face with a cloth that remembers better days. The cold shocks you awake in the places you were trying to pretend were already awake. Your scalp is a field where straw has been growing all morning. You smooth it down with your palm, which does nothing but move the hay from one hill to another. Food is another rumor. When it arrives in the language of boiling. You add something to the pot. Barley, if the harvest was kind. Oats, if the season was ordinary. A marrowbone, if you have a friend who has a cousin who is a miracle. Cabbage is a frequent guest, invited because it is loyal. It never brings joy, but always shows up. The scent is thick and loyal too, weaving itself into your cloak so that when you kneel in church, the saints get a noseful of your supper and decide not to judge. The pot complains at the edges with tiny bubbles, like tiny monks trying not to gossip. You stir with a spoon that used to be a better spoon before the fire discovered it, and you think about salt the way modern people think about vacations somewhere with a complicated cocktail and an ocean that does not want to kill them. Salt is possible, but it is not promised, and when it comes, you use it as if it were holy. Illness has a way of introducing itself without knocking. It comes in on the wind, in the cough of your neighbor, in the innocent kiss of a child who loves you too hard to aim away. The village vocabulary for sickness is a mixture of saints and seasons, humors and habits, and you keep them all in your mouth like charms. You know the sound of a cough that will pass, and the sound of a cough that will take someone with it. The first is simply rude. The second is a bell, tolling low, unheard and undeniable. Your joints ache with the legacy of damp. Your back writes letters of protest you do not have time to read. You have herbs, a few, dried and cracked, the green of them faded to a prayer. You crumble them into hot water, you breathe the steam, you tell yourself it helps. It might. Help is sometimes a synonym for belief. You do not fear death the way modern people fear it. You fear the timing and the cost and the mess it leaves behind in the corner of the room where someone had been sleeping. You fear the gap at the table, where a bowl will be empty for longer than anyone can stand to look at it. Disease is not a plot twist here. It is a character in every scene, a quiet extra who knows all the lines. When winter comes, it is not the wolves you worry about. It is the way cold turns chests into locked doors and refuses to let breath pass, as if breath had committed a crime. You lift a blanket. You tuck it around the ribs of the person you love, and pretend that wool can bargain with fevers. Comfort does exist in little corners where it has learned to be small. There is the place near the hearth where the floor has actually dried, where your toes remember warmth, the way old soldiers remember youth. There is the stool that rocks less than the others, the one with one good leg and 3 ambitious ones. There is the spoon that fits your hand as if it has finally given up resisting your grip and decided to belong to it. There is the smell of bread when it is still 6 hours away, but arrogant enough to announce itself early. The quiet in the house in that moment when everyone has found their task, and their task does not require comment. Your neighbors are part of comfort too, though calling them comfort might be generous. They are mirrors that reflect your life in shapes you can diagnose. The woman next door has the same rash your child has, and she swears by goose fat, which you don't have, but she also swears by time, which you have too much of when it hurts, and not enough of when it heals. The old man 2 doors down, door being a metaphor for gap in the wall with opinions about hinges, says that the pain in his knee is the ghost of a winter that promised to teach him humility, and succeeded. He laughs, which turns into a cough, which turns into a wipe of his mouth with a sleeve so seasoned it could flavor soup. He is still here. You count that as data. There is a politics to comfort. You cannot hoard it, not here. If you are seen to have too much, questions sprout like mushrooms after rain. If you have nothing, the village notices too, and someone appears with a bowl and a shrug and says it is nothing, which is a lie. The balance is precarious. You trade favors like currency that never depreciates because everybody remembers who brought a firebrand when your hearth died in the middle of snow, and everybody remembers who closed their door when you were coughing in the lane. Comfort is communal, which is a pleasant word for the fact that none of you can afford loneliness. The church is not comfort, not exactly, but it is certainty, and sometimes certainty is more useful. The building itself is colder than a grudge. Stone keeps secrets, and the secret of stone is that it always prefers winter. You go because the village goes. You kneel because your knees know how. The priest talks about mercy in a voice that is not loud enough to scare God and not soft enough to soothe the babies. He asks for tithes you don't have, and forgiveness you have not yet asked from yourself. You listen because listening is a habit, and because habits keep you alive. The candles smell like tallow, which smells like work, which smells like your life. You follow a procession once a month to the edge of the fields, where the prayers are thrown into the soil like seeds that will never germinate but might frighten the crows. You love the crows anyway. They are honest thieves. Night brings its own fashion show of discomforts. The bed is a democracy of limbs, except no one voted and the loudest snore wins. You lie down and every muscle tries to argue the case for why it should be allowed to detach and leave. The straw whispers. The blanket sighs its heavy, damp sigh. The cold crawls into the bed with you like a cat that hasn't paid rent. You arrange yourself around it, a polite host, because turning it away would be rude and impossible. Your children tangle themselves at your shins, small furnaces with unreasonable feet.
Your spouse rolls, your neighbor coughs through the wall thin as a promise, and somewhere beneath you something tiny that eats grain scratches out a love letter to the night. You pretend not to read it. You are too tired to be brave. Sometimes there is a luxury. A stone warmed at the hearth wrapped in a scrap of cloth, tucked at your feet like a dragon egg you do not deserve. It loses its heat in an hour,
but the memory of its warmth lasts 3, and by then you have a dream. A foolish thing where pillows exist, and they are not sacks of something pretending to be feathers. In the dream you are rich enough to be bored. You wake up before the plot thickens. Sickness again. It would be dishonest not to return to it. Your neighbor's child burns with a fever and raves in a language no one taught him. The wise woman comes with her basket that smells like a hedge and a lifetime of watching. She presses a hand to the child's chest and listens to a drumbeat that is off by 1. She shakes out a packet of dried leaves and tells the mother to brew it like courage. She mutters to a saint who specializes in this, though the saints have specialties the way you have shoes, dubiously. The child lives, or he doesn't. Both endings are true in this village, which is to say one house is singing while another is quiet in a way that makes the air too heavy to breathe. You keep stirring your pot. The pot knows how to hold grief without boiling over. Clothing changes with the season in a way that is less about fashion and more about survival math. In winter, you put everything on you own, and then you put on the thing you were saving in case there was something worse than winter, and then you consider the dog. You wrap your head not to be handsome, but to keep your ears. You wrap your hands not to be clean, but to keep your fingers. In summer, you take things off very slowly because having less between you and the sun feels like a betrayal you will have to answer for later. Your skin turns the color of work. Your hair smells like people, which is not ideal, but is honest. Comfort, when it finally visits in a way that can be named, is often something small and secret. The way steam fogs a bowl on a night when the frost has etched flowers on the wall. The way a child's laugh suddenly remembers the sound of spring. The way your spouse's hand finds yours in the dark and refuses to let go when a dream tries to steal you. The way a story is told, by the hearth, about a saint who went into the snow without shoes and came back with a miracle that looks suspiciously like good timing. You pretend to believe the story, and in pretending, you do. There are luxuries that would embarrass a lord because of how humble they are. A new pair of socks knit by a cousin with patience and a questionable sense of proportion. They bag at the ankles and pinch at the toes, and you love them as if they were a castle. A needle with a point that has not yet made enemies with every thread in the house. A scrap of linen so clean you hesitate to use it for anything but joy. A bit of honey that turned up in trade and turns any mouthful into a festival. You hide it, you share it, you argue with yourself, and lose in both directions. The house becomes a second skin you never take off. You know where to step to avoid the board that bites. You know which wall leans into the wind like an old friend who refuses to leave the tavern. You know the exact sound the pot makes when it is telling you it is bored of boiling and ready to be eaten. The roof drips in the same place every rain, and you have placed a bowl there not to catch the water, but to teach the drip manners. The bowl is a teacher with poor results. In summer, flies stitch the air with their noisy alphabet. In winter, silence does the stitching, and you read it with your breath. If you fall ill, and sooner or later you do, you join the ongoing negotiation with your body as if it were a neighbor who owes you grain. You cajole it with sleep, which you can rarely afford. You bribe it with broth, which costs time you do not possess. You scold it when it refuses to attend to the day's chores, which is unkind and also the only music you know how to play. The village doctor, if the word can carry such weight, is a man who understands bones because he has broken his own enough to recognize the sound, or a woman who knows which plant is a friend and which is a liar. They do what they can. Sometimes they do nothing because nothing is what there is. Yet, somehow, there are moments of ease that last longer than a blink. The afternoon when the wind forgets to bite. The week when the coughs are gone and the silence in the evening is not grief but peace. The Sunday when the priest's sermon drifts over your head like a cloud that does not threaten rain, and the sun slips through a window and lays a small gold coin on the floor, and your child tries to pick it up and laughs when it breaks under their fingers into light. You will never be rich, but you will know exactly what that laugh is worth. You prepare for night like a sailor prepares for a storm, even on nights when the sky is gentle. You stack the wood you can spare as if it were treasure and you are a dragon. You bank the fire under a quilt of ash that leaves it breathing just enough to remember how in the morning. You shake the blanket over the bed and shake out 3 small witnesses who scurry back into the thatch to draft their next complaint. You tuck your children in like letters you want the night to read carefully and return uncreased. You say words, some to God, some to luck, some to the stubborn part of yourself that keeps standing up when the day sits you down hard. You lie there. You listen to the roof. It crackles with cold, a kind of poetry no one writes down. Your fingers find the roughness of the wood at the edge of the bed, a familiar geography mapped by hundreds of tired hands sliding past it. Your breath slows. For a moment, nothing hurts, or rather everything hurts, but the hurt is distant, a horizon you acknowledge without visiting. Your last thought before sleep is not noble. It is not, "I made it." It is the smaller arithmetic of tomorrow. How much grain is left, whether the goat looked at you with contempt or with conspiracy, whether the priest will notice if you occupy the warmer pew, whether you can borrow a pinch of salt without admitting what it is for. You drift. The cottage holds you, the way a palm holds a pebble, not tightly, not loose, simply with the familiarity of long habit. And just before the dark takes the room and takes you with it, you admit to yourself that you would not say aloud because it sounds like pride. You are good at this. Not the heroics of song, not the victories of banners, but the stubborn artistry of staying warm enough, fed enough, kind enough not to break anything that cannot be mended. In a world that prefers to shiver, you have learned how to be a small, steady heat.
Leisure arrives in your world like a stray cat, late, suspicious, and likely to run the moment you look at it too directly. You don't schedule it. It sneaks in between chores, in the gap after wood is stacked but before the pot decides to boil, in the breath after a prayer but before the priest remembers something else you owe. You learn to recognize leisure by the way time loosens its jaw for a second and stops chewing on you. It is not grand. It is a sip, a scrap, a corner seat on a bench you had to fix yourself. If you blink, it becomes work again. Your first and most loyal leisure is talk, not conversation in the decorative sense, with opinions about plays and politics, but talk the way bread is talk, simple, daily, necessary. You meet a neighbor at the well where the rope has that one fray everyone pretends not to notice, and you trade words like eggs, gently. How is the calf? Lopsided but alive. How is the sow? Angry, but that's the breed. How did your son sleep? With his feet on my kidneys, which is the custom. You nod, you add a smile when the wind is unarmed, and in those 3 minutes the village remembers it is a village and not a cluster of separate problems wearing hats. On Sundays, when the bell finally persuades the air to cooperate, you walk to church in a long thread of people tied together by habit. The path is muddy or frozen, or, on rare days, both, an achievement of meteorology no one requested. You arrive early because the pew that remembers your shape is warmer than the pew that does not. The building is cold enough to make your breath behave like incense, which the priest counts as a win. You listen to stories older than the road itself. A saint who slept on a rock as if it were a featherbed. A fisherman who obeyed a voice and caught mercy with a net. A martyr whose biography seems to require implausible lions. You believe some of it, and the part you can't, you treat as weather. Real, whether or not you approve. The church is leisure's respectable cousin. The priest gives you a calendar in stone and chant, a year with a spine. Advent leans toward Christmas like a candle toward a window. Candlemas scolds the cold. Lent walks you, reluctantly, through the polite starvation you already practice by default. Easter shocks the mud with light, and even your tired knees notice. Rogation days take the whole village out to bless the fields, which is miraculous in its own way because no one argues loudly while the holy water is midair. There are feasts, the kind with bread shaped like symbols everyone pretends to understand, and there are fasts, which mostly mean relabeling what you were already going to eat as virtuous. If leisure has a tavern, yours is a long room that smells like wood, yeast, and the opinions of men who have had a necessary amount of ale. The ale is weak by modern standards and strong by morning standards. The bench wobbles because the man who made it had honest hands and an argument with angles. You sit anyway. Dice clatter, carved from bone, smoothed by 1,000 shakes, ready to break the heart of anyone who confuses luck with strategy. Someone brings out a board scratched with lines, and 2 people play 9 men's Morris with the concentration of surgeons and the trash talk of brothers. You watch, you learn nothing, you enjoy it. A song rises without permission, the old kind that wears 10 verses like layers and ends only when it gets bored of its own echo. The chorus belongs to everyone, especially those who are singing it wrong. Storytelling is the village's theater, library, and mildly dishonest news service. You have your storytellers, the woman whose voice can turn a turnip into a quest, the shepherd who has seen not just wolves but metaphors for wolves, the miller who swears on his wheel that he is telling the truth and gets a laugh every time. Stories arrive with names, King Arthur, Charlemagne, saints with improbable job descriptions, and slip into your cottage at night like extra blankets. They explain the weather with giants, and the taxes with devils, and your neighbor's sudden luck with a ring that might be fairy and might be forged. You don't need proof. You need a plot that makes the winter shorter. Children have their own republic of leisure, fierce and chaotic. They play with sticks because sticks are masters of disguise. Swords, looms, fishing rods, yokes for tiny oxen who would rather be rocks. They chase chickens, who write rude letters with their feet and refuse to be caught. They play knucklebones with real knucklebones because your world does not waste parts. They invent rules with the authority of small gods, change them mid-game, and declare victories that last exactly until supper. They learn the year by the taste of mud and the bite of nettles, by which trees are good for climbing and which for confessions. Festivals keep the village from forgetting how to be loud. At Michaelmas, debts are tallied and servants change places, a ritual that hums with relief or dread depending on who is packing. At May Day, if your priest tolerates such things, and many tolerate what they cannot fully stop, green branches arrive in arms that should be resting, and a pole stands where yesterday there was only mud. You dance not because you are skilled, but because the earth seems to ask for it. You stamp cold out of your bones, you laugh, you pretend not to notice who looked at whom with that look. At harvest time, the village thanks the weather for not actively hating you this year. The loaf brought to church is serious bread, and the bite you take from it tastes like, finally. Some leisure is work with a better story. Spinning in the doorway is a chore. Spinning in a circle of gossip becomes a parliament that actually passes laws, most of which regulate nothing but laughter. Mending is a sentence. Mending together is an essay on the human condition with notes on whose goat escaped and why your cousin's suitor smells like the river. Brewing is chemistry. But when you stand shoulder to shoulder with your neighbor and watch the froth rise with a suspicion of magic, it is also a rite. The alehouse is the village's unofficial court, but the spinning circle is its unofficial news, and you never know which one will save you. Belief threads through everything, sometimes pious, sometimes petty. You make the sign of the cross when the wind changes and when it forgets to. You tuck a scrap of palm behind a beam and dare moths to argue with it. You mutter a charm at the churn because the butter doesn't listen, but the butter is stubborn, and you need to feel smarter than it. The holy and the homely live in the same drawer. A priest blesses your seeds. A hedgewoman blesses your sleep with a sachet that smells like a meadow that remembers warmer months. Between them, you carve out a superstition that works just well enough to be worth the time. Courtship, when it shows up, wears boots and mud like medals. There is no candlelit restaurant, but there is a church porch, where 6 unwise whispers have been overheard and transformed into policy. There is the field where hands learn each other not by touch, which would be impolite, but by the proof in work. The way she lifts, the way he learns, the way both of you ignore the weather until the weather sulks. There are fairs, nexus points where strangers exist, strangers with eyes you have not practiced ignoring yet, strangers with belts too wide or hats too hopeful. Marriages here are diplomacy, economy, and occasionally romance. A kiss stolen in the lane will be returned with interest by the whole town the next day, but for 1 second, the lane is a kingdom. Fairs are the village flipped and expanded, a carnival of inventory. Traders arrive with colors that look like arguments and spices that smell like rumors, and you lose a morning discovering that there are more kinds of knives than there are problems you can solve with them. You stare at cloth that remembers sunsets from countries you will never spell, and bells that talk in different dialects of ring. A man shows you a puppet show that explains theology better than last week's sermon, which you decide is fine because the puppets are very persuasive. A storyteller from another river banks the fire of the crowd with a tale you have never heard. And for a blissful quarter of an hour, the cold forgets your name. Leisure does not erase danger. It edits it. Games can breed grudges, especially when dice agree to betray a man 2 nights in a row. The alehouse can ferment truth into a confession that should have stayed in the heart. A festival can turn in a flash of news from far away into a prayer meeting. Even a wedding feast must be guarded against shortages, against sudden rain, against that one uncle who drinks prophecy and wakes up penitent. The village survives by remembering that delight is a guest who always leaves the floor sticky, and therefore must be invited anyway. You own fewer objects than a modern broom closet. So your pleasures lean on senses. Sound, the winter quiet crunch of a sledge on snow, the spring quick tangle of birds rehearsing bass and treble in the hedge, the round applause of a good loaf's crust cracking. Smell, smoke that has almost convinced you it is your ancestor, damp earth negotiating with sun, tallow, which you claim to hate but miss when the candle is gone. Touch, the small victory of warm stone at your feet, the surprising softness of a lamb's ear, the satin of a good onion skin. Sight, a sky that performs without tickets, the first thin green on the field like the world remembering it had a plan. Your child's face when a rhyme lands correctly. Taste, honey, rare and immediately surrounded by 20 opinions about whether to spend it. Apples smug with their own crunch, a bit of cheese so confident it walks into the room 2 minutes before you do. Laughter is your scandalous luxury. You laugh at the priest's mule who believes itself a philosopher and refuses to argue with mud. You laugh at the shepherd who named each of his sheep after sins and now confesses to wrangling envy and flattery out of your garden. You laugh at yourself when you carry a bucket to the well, only to realize you left the bucket at the stream. You laugh at the pilgrim who swore a relic would cure aching feet and then cursed the road for 5 miles in 4 languages. Laughter eats nothing, mends nothing, warms nothing, and yet it is the one thing that makes the night forget to be so long. When winter's jaw clamps down, leisure retools itself for survival. Story circles thicken like stew. The good chair, which is simply the one that bites least, rotates by right of age or by right of, I got there first, a law older than Rome. Wood is counted the way coins are counted. Flames are spent with the care of bankers. You bring work indoors and call it company. A neighbor arrives with a spindle, another with mending, another with a baby who refuses to believe in sleep. The talk is about nothing until it is about everything. Someone hums a tune that remembers summer. Someone else adds a harmony that remembers last year's harvest and pretends not to notice the crack where the ceiling tells you the weather can read. The holy days land like islands. Christmas comes with smells you have been hoarding all year, a handful of spice robbed from trade and sworn to secrecy, a better cut of meat that asks for storytelling at the table, a candle you have saved just to make the room look briefly like it can afford gold. The priest's Latin is honey you cannot digest, but you lick the spoon anyway. You eat too much by the standards of your normal life, which means you eat enough by the standards of any sane world. You sing songs you barely remember correctly, and no one corrects you. The baby sleeps through the part where you promise to be good next year, which is wise. The social glue is most visible when it fails, which is not often. A fence breaks, and not just the owner shows up. 2 neighbors arrive with tools that have done this dance before, and between the 3 of you, you find a rhythm that gets the fence to stand. A roof loses a fight with wind and is shamed into lying politely by a crew who brought more thatch than they admit and fewer complaints than they should. A widow finds a loaf on her step and a pinch of salt beneath it, both anonymous with the anonymity of people who refuse to be thanked because thank yous feel like debts and no one wants to keep track. If strangers pass through, and they do, roads like a good gossip, your leisure changes accent for an evening. You listen to a tale of a city with more people than cows, which offends your understanding of mathematics. You learn a new song that has a chorus arranged for hands, which appeals to you because harmony is expensive, but clapping is free. You trade them your old story about the woman who churned a devil out of her butter, and both parties leave satisfied that the world is bigger and smaller than they feared. Strangers leave bits of themselves like burrs on a cloak. You brush some off, you keep some,
You build a new superstition just in case. The little games you permit yourself are modest, but you are immodestly good at them. You can pit two twigs in a stream and wager which will arrive first at a stone. And you can do it with such conviction that when your twig wins, you feel like a general. You can guess tomorrow's weather by how loudly the door complains, and then declare victory no matter what the sky does. You can carve a whistle from a branch that will call a child home from the far end of a field. And the first note is leisure, even if the second is discipline. Your beliefs make rules for leisure in small print. You don't play dice on a Friday because your grandmother didn't, and she lived long enough to tell everyone why. You walk around a certain tree once before you sit beneath it because a man once fell asleep there and woke up married, which might be a blessing or a caution, depending on which husband you ask. You mark the first swallows with a joke about how the saints sublet the sky to them for a season. You keep ash from last year's hearth to start this year's fire and call it thrift. And when someone calls it luck instead, you do not argue. In the evening, you sometimes get the epic version of leisure. A traveling mystery play sets up a stage on wagons and performs the universe with paint, ropes, and audacity. God appears in blue and thunder stolen from a drum. Devils have better lines and worse table manners. A man in a very serious beard is Noah, and his wife is the loudest woman you've ever adored. The village children recreate it for a week afterward with dolls made of rags and sticks. And when the priest frowns at the devil's jokes, everyone laughs because the devil is very committed to the role and also because the priest laughed first. When the day has behaved, leisure earns the right to be quiet. You sit by the door, which is trying to decide whether to stay in its frame, and you whittle nothing into almost something. A peg that will fasten a thought, a spoon that will taste of your patience. Your spouse hums a tune that requires neither memory nor talent, and therefore sounds perfect. The child nearest to sleep invents a question that fabricates 5 more. The cow shifts her weight like a sermon on stability. This is not rest, not yet, but it is the runway. And because you are stubbornly human, even in a world that doesn't have the budget for human extras, you make art in the margins. A pattern stitched on a cuff no one but you will notice. A carved leaf on a beam that only you and the spider respect. A rhyme that fits your field like a lid fits a pot. You tell a joke to the moon that you will forget by morning, and the moon will remember for 1,000 years. Leisure is not a thing you own. It is a way you prove you are not owned. When night asks for volunteers, you deliver yourself. The house, which has spent the day pretending to be a barn, pretends now to be a ship. The wind is the sea, and the thatch is the sky, and you are a passenger with a ticket made of yawns. Someone tells one last story about a hero who kept a coal in his hand all winter and warmed the whole village by refusing to let go. Everyone knows it is a metaphor. Everyone also knows a man once tried something similar and invented a scar shaped like St. Bridget. You tuck the story under your tongue. You blow out the candle, or more truthfully, the candle gives up while you're still mid-sentence. Leisure has done what it can. It has stitched the day where it ripped, cushioned the hours that were too sharp, poured a thin layer of sweet over the taste of turnip. Tomorrow will not ask whether you are refreshed. Tomorrow is not polite. But you have, in your awkward, thrifty way, collected enough softness to line the edges of the dark. You close your eyes. The village closes its many eyes. The last sound you hear is neither prayer, nor wind, nor mouse. It is the smallest laugh, escaping someone who ran out of reasons and remembered pleasure anyway.
Violence in your village is not a headline. It is weather. Some days it is a drizzle of insults that never quite become rain. Some days it is a gust that knocks the pot lid off and sends the stew into the fire while everyone stares like the stew did something wrong. Once in a while it is a storm, and the whole place holds its breath while the sky argues with itself. You learn to read the sky. You learn to read people the same way, by the tilt of a jaw, by the way a hand rests on a tool as if the tool had an older name. Quarrels begin where work begins, at boundaries. A hedge that leans too friendly into a neighbor's plot is not a plant, it is an accusation. Your fence forgets itself by a hand's width, or their furrows creep as if they are curious about your soil, or a pig discovers that rules are a suggestion. Voices rise. You say only a finger's breadth, which is an inch in church and a mile in court. They say God sees, which is either comforting or a threat, depending on whether you think God keeps a ruler. You negotiate with a stick in your hand, because nothing important is ever discussed without one. The stick pokes the ground and draws a line that will be remembered for 3 seasons and forgotten in the 4th, because snow edits everything. Sometimes it's grain. Your sack comes back lighter than it left the mill, and the miller swears the river did it. You swear the miller did. He puts his hand on the wheel the way a man puts a hand on a saint's statue, and says he would never. The wheel keeps turning, indifferent, working its slow jaw on the year. You tell yourself not to make an enemy of the man who controls flour. You tell yourself you can live on turnips and stubbornness. You cannot. You let it pass this time. Next time, you will bring a friend, because witnesses are insurance you can afford. There is a court, if you can call it that. The Lord's hall smells like wood smoke and opinion, and the bailiff has a face that was carved by a man who ran out of patience halfway through. People gather in their best, not bad clothes, which is to say, the same clothes as yesterday with a cleaner conscience. The reeve reads names with a voice that would rather be anywhere else. Fines fall like the light through the high window, narrow, expensive, not enough to warm you, but enough to make you squint. Someone is charged with breaking the assize of bread, which means their loaves were both too light and too confident. Someone else is accused of selling ale that tasted more like rain than like ale. The punishment is public, because privacy is for lords and lies. Stocks wait in the square with the patience of furniture, and sometimes they are occupied by a man whose greatest crime was having neighbors with long memories. The stocks and pillory are not gore. They are humiliation with architecture. You pass the man you argued with about the hedge 2 months ago, and his head protrudes through wood like a philosophy gone wrong. He pretends not to see you, which is difficult when seeing is the only thing left to do. Children practice archery with turnips. Women practice opinion with words, which sting more in winter when there is less to distract you. A priest wanders by and practices mercy by looking as if he is late for an appointment with God. The man in the boards vows never to sell thin ale again, and the village vows nothing in return. Afterward, he will drink at the alehouse and pretend he was never taller than the rest of you. Violence wears domestic shoes, too. A husband returns from the field with a temper that decided to arrive an hour earlier than he did. A wife comes back from the well with news that someone said a thing about someone else's sister, and somewhere between the bucket and the doorway, the rumor grows teeth. Voices rise, a stool declares itself a weapon, a pot lid becomes a shield, and then, like weather, it passes. A bruise appears and behaves like an apology nobody is brave enough to say out loud. You wish this were rarer. You wish a lot of things. You keep an eye on your neighbor's window. There are lines you pretend not to see
until you decide they are not lines, but cliffs. And then you intervene with bread, with space, with 3 other women and a priest who does not ask enough questions. Survival makes you practical about what you will not tolerate, and practical about what you cannot fix today. Thieves exist, of course, not the romantic kind with feathered hats and clever Latin, the kind who decide that your chicken would rather live in their pot. You sleep lighter in winter when hunger teaches boldness. The dog has opinions and expresses them at midnight with enthusiasm that satisfies no one. If a hand slides the latch, you have a stick within reach, and your voice learns how to fill a room without waking a child. If you catch the thief, the village will decide whether this is a crime or a misunderstanding, and which one depends on how many winters we have all shared. First offenses become loud lectures. Second offenses become community projects involving rope and wood and an audience. After that, we all hope for spring, because the best policeman is a full stomach. Outlaws linger like weather reports from far roads. You hear about them from a peddler who wanted to sell ribbons and got his pack lightened of everything but the ribbons. He describes men who live in hedges and wear the same jacket they stole 2 years ago, now part garment, part map of escape routes. You nod and tighten your belt. The path between villages learns your face, and you learn to carry nothing worth dying for. The trick is convincing your body that its life is not worth dying for either, in case someone tries to negotiate. You walk in groups when you can, you travel by daylight, you praise saints that specialize in roads, and you step on the shadows like they owe you money. Larger violence arrives in boots you can hear before you see them. Soldiers, or men who have decided that today they will be soldiers because there's a banner, and a banner excuses many things. They claim they are marching for a Lord's name that reaches your ears like a rumor about weather in a different country. They ask for food in the tone of men who plan to be obeyed, no matter how you define ask. You bring out bread and hide your best loaf under a child who does not move because the child understands strategy. The men laugh like doors slamming. One pokes your pig with the tip of his spear, the way a bored boy pokes a fire. You smile in the way that means, please, leave us in one piece. They do, mostly, but they take a chicken, and your neighbor's temper, and the weak's sense of safety. After they go, the village examines the ground for footprints and calculates how many days of quiet those prints have purchased. War is a story told by other people far away, with verbs like glory. For you, war is a change in prices, a rumor that the bridge is not safe, a missing man who left with beans in his pocket and came back with scars that do not match the number of his stories. War is taxes that arrive dressed as aid, and it is a road with too many strangers on it. War is the look on your neighbor's face when the letter he cannot read is read to him, and he agrees to something his body cannot afford because saying no to a lord is like saying no to the weather. You tie a charm around his wrist because it is the only currency you have. He leaves anyway. You keep his bench warm as if benches remember loyalty. Punishments can be tidy or theatrical. Fines are tidy, though money has to be dragged to your house with a rope. Whipping is theatrical. It looks worse than it is until it is not. The line between spectacle and injury is thin and badly lit. The executioner, if you want to call him that, is a man who would rather be mending a boot. But boot mending doesn't keep order. He works quickly because speed is a kind of mercy and because the village has work to do. If the crime is grander, arson that didn't stop at gossip, theft that tried to become a hobby, The gallows on the hill clears its throat. You climb to watch because not watching is also a kind of sin, and because fear is a lesson that refuses to be learned in the abstract. You stand with your children and answer their questions with answers that point in two directions at once, at the necessity of law and at the possibility that the law is a person having a day. There are witch stories, of course, whenever cows sicken or butter sulks in the churn or a man's luck falls into a well, but your century is stingier with fire than the future will be. The charge arrives more often as a
Muttered complaint than a court record. People remember that last winter the accused shared her bread when your pot was thin, and memories like that can push a rumor back across a threshold. You tie a rowan twig anyway, because belief is cheaper than doubt and smells nicer. The priest scolds charms and blesses seeds in the same week. Everyone decides not to take notes. The manorial court is fond of oaths. You swear by saints you do not have a personal relationship with. You swear by crops that have not yet consented to grow. You place your hand on a book whose words look like a flock of very well-behaved birds, and you promise to tell the truth, as if truth were a thing you could hold without dropping. The scribe scratches with a feather, and your life becomes a line that tilts to the right, like a field that had too much rain. If you win, the victory is a feeling, not a feast. If you lose, the loss is bread, or wood, or the right to be smug for a week. Either way, you go home, and the door complains exactly as much as it did yesterday. You develop skills that have nothing to do with weapons. You learn to hear a voice before the voice hears itself. You learn which neighbor's temper is short in the morning and long by dusk, and which is the opposite. You learn how to start an argument with a joke and end it with bread. You learn that bringing a pot of thin stew to a boundary dispute changes the boundary by an inch in your favor, and that no one will admit this, and that everyone will do it anyway next time. You become a professional in the field of not making things worse. Raids are rarer than rumors about raids, but they happen. Once, a band from the next valley arrives at night, convinced your village has hoarded grain, as if grain were a hobby. They are wrong, but wrong does not prevent theft. The bell, the one you ring for saints and storms, rings for men, and the sound is not music. Men stumble out with tools pretending to be weapons, forks that have met hay, flails that would rather flirt with threshing than with skulls. Shouting happens, blows happen. One man bleeds and later says it's nothing, and it is nothing until it isn't. The rest of his life is a story about weather that changed his knee. The raiders vanish the way guilt does when morning arrives. You count sacks and children. The count is close enough to be called mercy. Mercy is distance measured in inches rather than miles. Beneath the noise there is law that looks like a fence, not perfect, but functional. The hue and cry is a choreography everybody knows without rehearsal. If someone steals, you pursue. If someone escapes, you shout. If someone is caught, the village becomes a courtroom with muddy boots. Witnesses remember what they saw and also what they prefer to have seen. Justice is a sheep that everyone claims to own. Sometimes the Lord's men arrive and sort, sometimes they do not, and you sort yourselves. Either way, the sorting is never tidy enough to wash off. You accept that because acceptance is stronger than clean. Through it all, you keep going because going is cheaper than stopping. You keep a list in a place in your head that has never been written down. Who came when your roof leaked? Who looked away when your son's temper walked ahead of him? Who shared their salt? Who borrowed your last pinch and returned 2 pinches and a story? This list is more law than the law itself. It decides who hears the rumor first and therefore gets to adjust it. It decides whose fence is mended before rain, whose baby is rocked who in fever frowns, whose dead are carried on many shoulders instead of few. If this sounds like love, it is, but it is also accounting. You have a ledger you never show anyone, and you are not ashamed of keeping it. When violence arrives from outside, the village gathers. You hide what can be hidden, the better loaf, the seed you cannot afford to cook. The cup that was your grandmother's because it survived her and therefore deserves respect. You place the younger children under a bed and give the older ones jobs that are really occupations for their hands. You sit the dog by the door and explain manners. The men stand where the men stand, the women stand where the women stand. Everyone stands where they are most likely to be useful. Your bravery looks like stubborn furniture. After the storm, you sweep. It is the most defiant action you know. You sweep ash back where ash belongs, and straw back where straw lies politely, and anger into corners where it can be discovered later and dealt with in pieces. You count the spoons. You find them all, except for the one that had a chip shaped like a moon, and you mourn the moon for an hour longer than you mourn the spoon. You check the neighbor you argue with about hedges, because arguments do not exclude care. He is fine. He admits this with reluctance. You both stare at his fence and agree without saying that spring will require a conversation. Punishment shapes memory. The boy who is whipped becomes for a season the boy with a back, which is not a kind nickname, but is better than the one he had before. The man who stood in the pillory becomes the man who pays for ale now, as if paying were penance. The woman who shouted at the church door and refused to leave until the priest blessed the seeds twice is remembered as the woman who got 2 blessings and a sermon and 4 good rows of beans. Over time, stories sand their corners. The village prefers its history without splinters, unless splinters serve a moral. You teach your children how to walk around danger, how to put their eyes down when a rider's horse does not lower its gaze, how to step off a path, not to yield, but to survive, how to answer a question from a stranger with words that sound full and say nothing. You teach them names of neighbors with context, kind except on Tuesdays, generous except for salt, angry but fair when mending fences, an expert in finding lost sheep and starting rumors that are half true. You teach them saints by what they are good for: travelers, teeth, stubborn cows, lost keys if keys were something you owned. You teach them to run without bragging and to hide without shame, because shame is a luxury and running works.
Night deepens, and your house prepares to pretend it is warmer than it is. It begins with the walls, which are not so much walls as agreements between sticks and mud. Wattle and daubs sound romantic if you say them with enough confidence, like the names of a troubadour duo, but they are simply woven rods stuffed with earth, straw, and whatever else could be convinced to stop the wind. In summer, they keep secrets. In winter, they keep your breath within arm's reach. You run your palm over the surface and feel the hairline fractures where frost tried to write its name. You smear a new stripe of mud into the crack and call it repair. The mud says nothing, which is its way of agreeing. Your roof is thatch, a shaggy hat the house wears with pride and occasional vermin. It is thicker than any blanket and more opinionated. In rain, it drums. In frost, it whispers. In snow, it sulks and sags until men climb it like a stubborn hillside and coax the cold to slide off. You have learned to respect angles and gravity in equal measure. At the eaves, wind fingers for a weakness. You tuck bundles tighter and push in a wedge of straw until the draft becomes only a rumor. Somewhere, a mouse applauds your work by deciding to live exactly there, where your fingers just were. You explain rent. The mouse laughs. Windows, if that generous word applies, are holes that have learned manners. In summer, they are honest gaps. In winter, they become blurs of oiled parchment or horn, thin slices that turn daylight into a soft gas. Glass exists, yes, but not for you. Your shutters are wood that has been told to be a door, but was not good enough for the job. You close them and crossbar them, and the house darkens in a way that feels like privacy. You stuff moss and scraps into the seams as if you were bandaging the patient who refuses to keep still. The night presses its face to the cracks and breathes. You breathe back. The hearth is the real architecture. Everything else answers to it. Tonight, you build the fire with the patience of a strategist and the paranoia of a person who has counted the woodpile and did not like the answer. Oak is a king, ash a trusted captain, willow a sullen recruit. If you have peat, it smells like 1,000 summers compressed into a brick, and it burns with a thick, stubborn dignity that remembers bogs and refuses to hurry. You lay kindling like a story and coax a flame that starts as rumor, becomes gossip, and finally rises to testimony. The smoke chooses the hole above, or it doesn't. If it doesn't, you blink until tears become your evening drink. Smoke stains the rafters into star maps you will never learn. The fire warms your face and leaves your back to negotiations with the north. You practice the old trick called banking, pulling a quilt of ash over the coals until they glow like secrets. If you do it right, morning will remember fire. If you do it wrong, the hearth becomes a tomb for warmth, and you bury your pride in it and start again, cursing softly at your own biography. The curfew bell in the distant church is not about bedtime. It is a civic suggestion that you cover your fire before your cottage attempts to go to heaven in a single night. You nod at the bell as if bells understood sarcasm and smooth the ashes like a parent tucking in a stubborn child. Bedding is an economy of layers and hopes. Your mattress is a tick stuffed with straw or chaff, a compromise between comfort and agriculture. Tonight you fluff it by punching it with both fists until your hands tingle, redistributing the lumpy memories of last week's sleep. The sound it makes is the sound of a small field being convinced to be reasonable. If you are blessed with a handful of fresh straw, you add it as if you are explaining to the bed that the relationship matters to you, and you are trying. Feather beds exist in songs. In your cottage, feathers exist as proof that your blanket once belonged to something with opinions about geese. The blanket is wool because everything that keeps you alive in winter is either wool, wood, or willpower. It is heavy in the way that feels like an argument you have decided to lose for the sake of peace. You shake it by the hearth to evict small tenants who do not pay. You stitch new patches to old ones by lamplight, your needle making a constellation of little suns that have learned how to hold hands. Sometimes there is a pelt, sheepskin that still remembers its original owner with a smell like a barn memory. You lay it where feet turn into complaints and the complaints into ice. If you are lucky or Scottish or both, there is a box bed, a wooden cupboard with a mattress inside, a bed that closes like a thought. You slide the panel and the room disappears, and the small world that remains, the warm one, has borders you can defend. Clothes become architecture when the house fails. Linen next to skin, because linen drinks your sweat like a calm friend and returns it later as a cold betrayal if you are foolish. Wool above, because wool makes bargains with moisture and often wins. You wear your chemise, your hose, your braise, your tunic, your hood, and then the cloak. The same cloak that follows you from field to church to bed, a cape of stubborn sheep. You learn the art of the nightcap, the pinnacle of dignity, a fashion statement that says ears are treasures. On the coldest nights, you sleep wrapped like a rolled map, the village inside your blanket inside your arms, your intention to wake up. Footwear becomes winter sermons. Leather alone is an optimist. Leather with straw inside is a plan. You stuff your footwear with clean straw that crackles like small promises. It keeps the air moving, the damp guessing, the toes less insulting. Some nights you trade shoes for clogs, wooden logic that lifts you off the wet and teaches you to walk as if you were arguing with gravity. In deep winter, you bind your calves in strips of cloth, gaiters by any other name, to remind the wind that your legs are not a public road. Gloves exist if you invented them yourself. Mittens born of felted wool are your favorite because they are clumsy and therefore force you to move slowly, which is a blessing disguised as inefficiency. Animals are not roommates. They are radiators with personalities. The buyer end of the cottage is not only luxury for cows, it is a bargain. Their heat rises, your family sleeps above or beside it, and the night spends itself trying to decide whether to freeze you from wall inward or from floor upward. A pig's breath is a weather event. Chickens provide a confetti of warmth that is measurable only in optimism. You lay boards between you and the damp because the damp will always take the stairs if you let it. A rafter becomes a gallery of hanging herbs and tools, drying just enough to be useful in the morning. The refrain of the house is breath. Yours, theirs, the fire's, layered into a hum the wind fails to harmonize with. Light is rationed like honey. You have rushlights, reeds dipped in tallow, thin flames with the attention span of gnats. They spit and sulk and burn quickly, throwing a light that makes everything look like a story you half remember. A better night brings a tallow candle, its flame a pear-shaped sermon that drips hot punctuation onto the iron sconce. If fortune swings by disguised as a trader, you might have beeswax. Sunlight solidified and well-behaved, a glow that flatters faces and makes the room smell like summer's diary. You do not burn it for tasks, you burn it for moments. A birth, a death, a prayer that needs a stage. Water comes inside only if the bucket agrees not to become ice. You place it near the hearth like a cat that needs the reminder of manners. If it crusts, you break the thin lid with a wooden spoon and pretend the crack is satisfying. Washing is strategy, not ritual. You wipe hands, face, the back of the neck that holds the day's dust like it is sentimental. Teeth are persuaded more than they are cleaned. A twig chewed into a brush, a rinse of weak ale because water has been to places you do not want in your mouth. In sleep, mouths become weather instruments. In the morning, everyone forecasted frost. Warmth cheats are the currency of winter. A stone tucked by the hearth all afternoon becomes a foot sun at bedtime. You wrap it in cloth and pass it along the bed like a royal visiting his subjects. It loses its crown before midnight, but the throne remains warmed. A hot brick does the same job and doubles as a reason to argue about whose side of the bed requires more government. Some say bottles, but glass is a rumor this far down the road. You use jugs if you dare, and you do not always dare because nothing ruins a night like a bed that suddenly tries to grow a lake. You learn to be grateful for small-lived miracles. Curtains exist in dreams and in houses that have something to curtain off. If you have a scrap of coarse cloth, you hang it where the door gap insists on being architecture. The cloth is a diplomat. It turns a wind into a draft and a draft into an opinion. Over the bed, a sheet
Can be strung to make a canopy that catches the falling dust of the roof and the boring conversation of insects. You pretend it is luxury. It is actually physics, and therefore better. Food becomes heat by a process also known as soup. You put more in the pot at night than you intend to eat because a thick evening makes an obedient morning. The pot hangs on its trammel like a planet on a very local orbit, and you nudge it closer or farther from the fire with a poker that remembers the exact burn mark to aim for. You add oats, onions, whatever with backbone, and the steam climbs your face and tells your eyes that the world is worth looking at. A sip before sleep is less about hunger than about warmth that lingers at the center of you when the blanket refuses to negotiate with your shoulders. Air is a problem you solve without solving. You need it to live. You need it not to move. The thatch breathes whether or not you approve. The shutter leaks. The hearth drinks the room and exhales soot. You learn the trick of venting the worst of the smoke through the little high louver while keeping the warm air sulking inside. You learn which crack to stuff and which to let be because a sealed room suffocates dreams and people in equal measure. You listen to the house like a doctor to a chest. Does it rattle? Does it wheeze? Does it know the rhythm it should keep? You adjust. Winter is a conversation, not a victory. You keep a winter chest, not treasure,
but competence. Inside are the mended socks that will fray on Thursday, the better knife that sharpens itself on your patience, the bit of salt you refuse to admit exists. There is wool carded into clouds that will become thread when hands are idle and therefore in danger. There is a twist of dried thyme that is not medicine but acts like it. There is a bundle of spare rushes for the floor, for when the old ones remember too loudly what they have seen spilled. There are stories folded small enough to fit. The saint who loaned his cloak to a wind and got it back smelling like spring. The farmer who outstared February until the month blinked. Your body learns schedule's winter rites. You sleep early because night outnumbers day and insists on voting. You wake to feed the coals the way you wake to feed a baby, by instinct and grumbling. You roll to make the blood admit it still has a job. You place your feet on the floor as if the floor were a stranger whose mood you are carefully evaluating. You know which board bites. You pretend you don't, to keep yourself respectful. The night has partitions, before the first doze, between the two sleeps, after the second when the rooster lies and the sky agrees with him. In the middle, you sometimes get up to pee in the chamber pot and thank every saint involved for the invention of indoor decisions. Footing outside is a mess the moon enjoys watching. You spread straw on paths because straw is generosity that remembers it was once a field and acts accordingly. You put boards across hollows that have become opinions. Your door opens inward so the snow's jokes remain jokes. When the wind stacks drifts at the threshold like bouncers, you become your own shovel. The village lane transforms into a narrow canyon of white, and voices carry in it like rumors in a church porch. Night walks are brief and accompanied by the dog, who thinks every shadow is a theological problem he can solve by barking until the doctrine submits. Heat is not a permanent resident even when you do everything correctly. It is a guest and a critic. You learn to place people like furniture in the warmest geometry, the oldest by the hearth's shoulder, the youngest in the bed's center, the chronic cough under the heaviest wool. You turn beds into fleets, pallets launched near the fire on nights when weather decides to file a grievance. You invent a game in which the child who can keep their feet flat on the warm stone longest wins the privilege of the story's first choice. You always let them win. Survival looks like generosity, and sometimes is. Some tricks are so ordinary they look like faith. You keep a kettle steaming to fatten the air. You dry tomorrow's socks on a line that passes like a thought between two beams. You stack wood by size and attitude, quick burning to wake, slow burning to stay. The untrustworthy in a separate pile where you can glare at it. You save the crumb of beeswax to rub on the draftiest hinge because quiet is a temperature. You warm your hands, then warm your wrists, then the soft inside of your elbows, then, secret of secrets, the spot below your ribs. Heat multiplies where the blood is near, and you are an alchemist with the only metal that matters. Even the church has winter hacks. The holy water is not holy if frozen, so the priest keeps the font sulking near the hearth in the sacristy and pretends no one noticed. Processions go shorter and faster. Saints prefer brisk in January. Announcements include, between saving of souls and the next market day, the reminder to share embers if a neighbor's fire dies. The bell rope stiffens with frost and must be warmed by hands that pretend it's a snake being persuaded. You go, you kneel, you pray for sun and for the humility to accept gray. You light a candle for someone whose house breathes too much. Your body has its own small sorceries. You eat fat when you can because fat burns like oak in the furnace of you. You don't linger by the fire until your skin is fooled
You move because motion is the only hearth you can carry. You clamp your jaw and hum, discovering that your skull is a resonator that warms the head better than idle teeth. You teach the children to rub ears until they are not white. You watch noses. You become an expert in noses. You judge the weather by how much your breath must argue to stay visible. At the edge of it all is danger you acknowledge without inviting to supper. A brazier brought inside to show off its red coals can steal breath and the kind of silence that never returns anything it borrows. You know this. You keep it out, or you keep a door open to let in the argument of air. The thatch will burn if insulted. You do not insult it. Sparks are monarchs. You bow to them and smother them before they know they are kings. Children learn by example because lectures freeze in midair. You point, you show, you repeat. Winter is repetition disguised as necessity. Then there are the days that remind you why you do all this. A night falls so clear that the stars feel close enough to warm your face, and the frost on the lintel etches a fern so perfect you almost eat it. The house holds as if it were designed by someone who loved you. The fire behaves like a friend who knows when not to talk. The children sleep with the kind of seriousness that makes you believe in good governments. You crawl into the bed that is half straw, half hope, and everything closes around you like a secret you are allowed to keep. For a long moment, you are not cold. For a longer one, you are not afraid. Tomorrow will have its own complaints. Doors rehearse them all winter. But tonight you have done every trick your ancestors taught you, and a few you invented in a hurry. And the result is not luxury, not comfort as the rich spell it, but a warm border that holds against the dark. You fit yourself inside it. You take inventory. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a roof, a stubborn flame, a room where your breath hangs like a banner, claiming this space for the living. You close your eyes and let the ash do its quiet work. You have banked more than coals. You have banked another tomorrow.
Food is time made chewable, and your year is a recipe with too many editors. You begin to understand that survival is mostly planning against the appetites of months.
The calendar is not numbers, it is flavors, and the lack of them. Autumn is the generous aunt who arrives with baskets and opinions. Winter is the accountant who insists on columns, measurements, and the dull truth that you cannot eat today what February will need. Spring is a prankster who arrives with flowers and forgets to bring anything useful to the table. Summer is the show-off that takes credit for work done in quieter seasons. You listen to them all, but you obey the cellar. You live by stores. The granary is not grand. It is a loft that creaks like a man thinking. You climb a ladder that has known all your birthdays and push aside a wooden hatch that argues at every hinge. Inside, sacks wait like sleeping animals, their bellies full of a future you touch with both reverence and suspicion. You run a hand across barley and feel the cool slide of plenty, pretending not to be temporary. You tell yourself not to open one except for measure. You open it anyway because measure is a rumor and reassurance is a handful. The grain whispers arithmetic as it falls. A day, a day, a day. Each handful is a promise you can only keep if you stop keeping it. Preservation is your second trade. You salt because salt persuades time to slow down. A piece of pork looks at you with the tragic expression meat adopts when it realizes it will not be eaten fresh. You bury it in a barrel like a saint in a reliquary, and tell yourself that holiness is a spectrum and brine is on it. You smoke fish until the house smells like a shoreline in a memory. The fish hang from hooks as if they were gossiping.
You turn them so they inhale smoke evenly, like polite guests. When it is fasting day, and it is fasting day exactly as often as the church calendar says your stomach should practice humility, you thank the river for its compromises. Eels slip into stew pots like punctuation marks. Herring arrive by cart from a coast you will never clap eyes on, but will venerate with your teeth. Cabbages take the cellar like monks, squat, bald, devoted to endurance. Apples descend stairs like well-behaved children, and then misbehave by turning soft at the edges if you waste even a week. You wrap the better ones and sing to them with your hands, which is what careful sorting is called when it happens in the dark. On good years, you dry pears on racks and pretend you're rich, because sweetness has learned to wait. On bad years, you memorize the angle of the sun crossing a shelf where there is the space where sweetness would have been. The oven belongs to the village more than to any one house. Some homes pretend with clay domes, but the better bakes happen where the heat is a civic matter. The communal oven sits like a squat magistrate at the edge of the lane, and people bring their dough as arguments, and the oven delivers verdicts. You mark your loaves with symbols, not because bread is likely to run off with the wrong family, but because ownership is a spell, and you cast it whenever you can. The oven master judges temperature by hand and eyebrow. He feeds alder, ash, and superstition into the mouth until the interior glows like the memory of summer. Your loaf goes in small and hopeful, comes out sullen and heavy, or light and proud, depending on the day's alliances. When it is good, you hold it to your ear and listen to the crust crack, as if the bread were applauding its own birth. When it is bad, you call it soup ingredient and pretend that was the plan. Flour is always politics. The mill is the village's slow heart, turned by water that cannot be bribed but can be bullied with maintenance. You bring a sack, and the miller brings a measure, and between the two of you lies the ancient question of how much is owed to the wheel, to the Lord, to the right of the man who stands nearest the flow and calls the tune. The wheel chews. The stones shed a little of themselves into your flour, a gritty dowry. Your teeth nod and plan a quiet surrender over the next decade. You shoulder home a weight that promises to be bread and try not to do the arithmetic out loud where ears could accuse you of ingratitude. Tithe barns have their own gravity. You have not eaten enough, and yet you carry a tenth to a space made of beams that remember forests, where the priest's steward counts with a seriousness that suggests God is not only listening, but checking his figures. The barn smells like harvest and holiness, and the wet wool of many sinners. The chalk on the posts keeps score and handwriting that the mice do not respect. You give because you cannot afford not to. You give because to live in a story without saints is an expensive loneliness. When the barn feeds the poor in a late winter that forgot manners, you're relieved to find some of your grain in someone else's bowl, and you scold yourself for the way relief feels like pride. Markets arrive like brief invasions every fair day. Stalls sprout from frames like thoughts from mouths, and the square turns into a chessboard where everyone pretends to be queens. A man unrolls cloth dyed with colors that behave better than weather. A woman slices cheese into miracles and offers you a pinch on the blade of her knife while her eyes measure your purse without blinking. A boy sells onions strung like rosaries, and you consider buying prayer. Prices are their own language. You read them in the shoulders of the sellers, in the shrugs of the buyers, in the way a cart leaves with more than it arrived with. Money changes hands with the reluctance of an old cow leaving a stall. You go home with what you needed, or with a story about why you did not, which is almost as useful if told correctly. Hunger has a season more precise than any saint's feast. The Hunger Gap, that comedy with no punchline between the end of winter's stores and the moment spring remembers vegetables are a thing. You stretch everything. You invent recipes your great-grandchildren will swear were traditions, and you hope to heaven they will be wrong. Nettles become noble when boiled into green respectability, and you bless the part of you that learned to pluck them without inviting litigation from your own skin. Sorrels lend brightness like gossip. You pull the last onions from braids that crackle like paper approvals. Sometimes the pot is a suggestion, and you live on thin broth flavored with the optimism that comes from smelling things that used to be stew. Foraging is your university. The hedgerow gives like a relative with a long memory and a longer list of conditions. In spring, it offers shoots that taste like the idea of cucumber. In summer, it applauds your thrift with berries that dye your fingers and your children's faces with smirks of purple. In autumn, it gives hips and haws, sour lessons in what sweetness costs when the year turns stern. Mushrooms are a syllabus of risk. You attend lectures in caution and leave exams to those with less to lose. Your nose becomes a professor. Your tongue becomes a cautious student. You carry home baskets and recipes and the odd beetle who wanted an education too. Livestock are walking larders with opinions. A hen is a clock that lays breakfast and sometimes an attitude. When a hen forgets her job, you mutter theology at her in the barn until she remembers or becomes stew, which is another kind of vocation. A cow is a breathing bank account. Milk is interest you draw down daily, saving what you can by turning it into something less perishable. Butter that keeps if salted. Cheese that becomes a wheel of patience. You learn to judge curds by the way they break like news you already expected. You press them under weights that look like small arguments with gravity. The cheese cave smells like a monastery's secret. You nod to it as you pass, because anything that saves you in winter deserves respect. You brew because water is suspicious, and because ale persuades calories to bring their friends. Your mash tun is a barrel that remembers being a tree. You steep grain until water tastes like tomorrow's courage, then boil it until steam is a house guest. Hops arrive later in some centuries. In others, you negotiate with Groot, a mixture of herbs that teach bitterness to walk on a leash. Fermentation is a household god that lives in a corner and asks for cleanliness and patience. You grant it one and pretend that the other. When the ale clears, you draw a cup, and the village sighs in the same key. Children drink it weak and call it small. Men drink it medium and call it wisdom. Women drink it as a wage for all the stirring they did while no one was watching.
Shape the weak like a ruler shapes a line. The church asks you to prove your piety by pretending that water food is morally different from land food. You obey, irregularly, and with grace. A cart of salted herring appears like a miracle someone forgot to light properly. The fish are stern, stiff, and convinced of their own virtue. You soak them until they admit to being edible. On rivers near monasteries, men with nets behave like bureaucrats who have discovered a loophole. Pike, carp, eels are all coins in a treasury of Fridays. If you are lucky enough to live within rumor's distance of the sea, you learn to love the arrogant silver of fresh herring as if it were a prince who consented to dine with you briefly before riding off to flatter richer cables. Seasons revise the menu with the confidence of kings. Spring brings eggs in such numbers that children look at omelets as if they were a chore. Greens happen whether you earn them or not. Your body becomes a grateful bell that rings for vitamin. Lamb appears on other people's plates or not at all, because flocks are futures, and eating a future is a decision you cannot afford. Summer is generosity with teeth. Everything ripens at once and dares you to keep up. You dry, pickle, brine, bury, and then you gossip about it, because gossip is the only thing that preserves better than vinegar. Autumn is the fastest cook. Apples, pears, damsons, plums, all the rude abundance that shouts, now, 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 while your hands repeatedly claim to be only two in number. Winter is logical. It eats what you saved and then asks unreasonable questions. You keep seed as if it were gossip about next year, in small bags labeled with memories, in clay pots hidden from mice with ambitions. You pick beans that rattled black pockets and peas that agreed to age gracefully. You select the best heads of grain for next sowing and feel noble and also hungry. You tell children that the seed is sleeping and not to wake it with greedy hands. They nod solemnly and steal two anyway, because children are experiments run by the universe. Trade happens in whispers and strings. A neighbor has apples and a need for wool. You have wool and a need for onions. You tie a knot on a cord for each favor and untie one for each repayment. A friendship abacus. The Lord's taxes prefer coin. Coin prefers not to be seen in villages like yours. Sometimes you pay in chickens, which is awkward for everyone, especially the chickens. Sometimes you pay in labor, which you were going to do anyway, and now it feels official and therefore heavier. The tithe takes a tenth. The tallage takes what it can. Your hope takes what is left and turns it into soup. The cooking fire is a stage, and you are the playwright, director, and critic. The pot hangs from a hook that learned to curve by watching the moon. You learn distances with your eyes. One notch closer and the stew sulks. One notch farther, and it forgives you but refuses to thicken. You crush garlic with a knife handle if you have garlic, and you feel like a king when you do. You grind mustard with a stone if a peddler's pack ever let you have such audacity. You stir clockwise because your grandmother said so, and counterclockwise when the stew needs scolding. You taste, you add, you watch. You feed the fire, you scold the child. You listen for hooves because hooves at dusk can mean visitors, or trouble, or both, and the stew must stretch accordingly. Flavor is a theology of small mercies. A pinch of salt can redeem a pot that was about to confess mistakes. A sprig of thyme makes turnips pretend they have traveled. Vinegar scolds fat into behaving. Honey apologizes for all the times you had no honey. Pepper exists in stories and in the hands of men who count money for a living. When a grain of it lands on your tongue, you feel like you are tasting a map. You have eaten so much barley that you can recognize its mood by smell alone. You dream of saffron once and wake up laughing because saffron is a rumor from a pilgrim who exaggerates. Poverty invents a cookbook with two instructions: make more and make do. You stretch meals with pulses, with oats, with crumbs that pretend to be croutons when fried in lard. Sausage is thrift translated into rope. Pottage is democracy. Everything gets a vote, and the majority becomes supper. When you have meat, you have a plan. The plan includes bones becoming broth, and broth becoming tomorrow's authority. When you do not have meat, you have a different plan. The different plan includes confidence. Confidence is edible, but only if the pot believes you. At night, the house smells like what you decided, and like the things you could not. Smoke becomes part of your language. Children learn to read its dialects. Too green, too proud, just right. The pot burps, the bread cracks its back. The spoon becomes a wand in the hand of a child who insists on tasting every 4 seconds, as if time itself required proof of progress. You laugh and swat and hand the spoon back because the child is the future, and the future insists on salt. There are feast days that briefly argue against your everyday arithmetic. A wedding stretches a cow across 3 households, with a ceremony of knives and obligations. The first pig killed after frost tastes like victory and guilt. The goose, for Martinsmas, shields the winter like a fat bishop. Pancakes appear before Lent as if they were ambassadors from a world where butter is not suspicious. You eat, you dance if dancing is allowed, and you swear to remember this night when snow pretends to be permanent. You keep the oath more faithfully than you have kept most promises made to yourself. When famine visits, it does not knock. Roads empty of traders. Prices rise until numbers learn to swim. Bread is adulterated with anything that can be ground: peas, beans, tree bark, if someone told a convincing lie. Bellies swell with hunger that mistakes itself for fullness. Men grow quieter. Women become narrow and fierce. Children stop asking questions. You look at the seed corn and decide not to look at the seed corn. You boil what is not poisonous with hope and discover both are thinner than you prefer. The church empties its barn by handfuls, and your contempt for taxes remembers how to be grateful. The spring after such a winter feels like forgiveness from a God who learned manners late. Then a good year happens, as if to apologize. The fields wear green like humility. The rain remembers when to visit and when to mind its own business. The granary grows heavy. The cellar smiles in the dark. You bake better. You share more. You forgive the miller 3 ounces on the sack because his child laughed like water this morning, and you are sentimental. You put aside a little extra salt because generosity in summer is an argument with winter you prefer to win in advance. You go to bed tasting the future and wake up to a rooster who agrees, for once, that mourning is a good idea. All of this, the storing, the salting, the smoking, the bargaining, the praying over pots, adds up to not being cold from the inside. The fire keeps your skin from remembering the wind too vividly. The stew keeps your bones from becoming a rumor. You survive the coldest nights not only because you learned how to insult drafts with moss and to court coals with ash, but because you learned how to turn hunger into arithmetic and arithmetic into soup. You manage comfort in spoonfuls. You ladle it out with the confidence of a saint who has never been canonized because no one has time to carve the statue. You sit with a bowl that burns your hands in a way that feels like approval. You lift it to your face and breathe steam that smells like a committee of vegetables trying their best. Outside, the frost rehearses its arguments on the door. Inside, your mouth is a republic that votes yes. You eat slowly because there is no prize for speed, and because the moment deserves to be longer than it can be. When the bowl is empty, you scrape it with a piece of bread that barely remembers it was a loaf. You lick your fingers because no one is watching and because you invented the etiquette of necessity. When everything is tidied with the spoon and the pot is set just off the fire to drowse, you allow yourself the kind of thinking you usually ban. What would it be like to have enough that you never counted? The thought is a candle. You let it burn until the tallow runs, and then you pinch it out with 2 fingers and smile at the little sting. Counting is not misery. It is music. You know the tune. You have made it dance.
Night is a country with its own laws, and none of them were voted on. The sun falls behind the hedgerow like a coin you will never find again, and suddenly every object in your cottage forgets its name. The broom is a stranger leaning in the corner. The stool is a low animal that might bite. The door is a mouth with black teeth. You strike the tinder and coax a sulky spark into a flame, and for a moment you become a god of very small, very local light. The fire answers in its dialect of crackle and hiss, a rough lullaby, and the room remembers what it is, a place where people happen today and will happen again tomorrow if the night agrees. Curfew is not a bedtime story. It is a bell from the church that travels through the lanes like a polite threat. It rings to remind fire to behave and people to stop pretending they are owls. You are not an owl. You respect the bell because the bell will be respected whether you do or not. Doors close. Bars are slid. A wedge goes under the latch because wedges are therapists for doors that can't commit. Outside, the dark organizes itself. Somewhere down the lane, a dog offers commentary that begins as a bark and graduates to philosophy. You tell your dog to keep his opinions to himself. He refuses, because he is a medieval dog and therefore a member of the parish council. The moon, when it bothers to attend, is a poor lantern with a good work ethic. It paints the frost on the waste ground so bright you could count the ruts, which would be useful if counting ruts were your hobby. The stars puncture the sky in familiar constellations you pretend to know by name. The plow, the hunter, the king who lost his way. Your neighbor calls them other names entirely and insists he is right because his grandfather said so, and grandfathers are peer-reviewed sources. You tell time by angles and guesses. The priest's office hours are written in Latin and bells. Your hours are written in chores and yawns. If the moon is fat and the frost is loud, you can see enough to carry wood without convincing your shin it has enemies. If clouds win, you sigh and move like a person who owes the dark money. The first sleep arrives early. You lie down under the heavy democracy of the blanket and sign the peace treaty with the straw. The children flop like landed fish until they find a comfortable angle disguised as your ribs. Your spouse issues a snore that could be used to frighten foxes from the henhouse. You sink. The fire's face softens, then mutters behind its ash mask. The house speaks in the slow grammar of cooling, a pop, a tick, a draft interrogating a hinge. You are almost gone when a flea remembers you owe it rent. You negotiate with a scratch that travels more than any pilgrim, and finally leave the meeting in a huff. Sleep takes you as if it has better things to do. Midnight is an intermission nobody paid for. You wake, not rested, not ruined, simply awake, as if your body kept an appointment you never wrote down. This is normal here, the split in the night like the seam in a tunic. First sleep, then wakefulness, then second sleep. You do what people do in that thin corridor of time. You stir the coals and whisper to them the way you would to a child, and they blush, pleased, and remember warmth. You step outside to use the chamber pot, which is not so much a pot as a misunderstanding waiting to happen. The air is the kind that bites and then apologizes too late. Your breath ascends in holy smoke no saint asked for. Back inside, you tuck a child's feet back under a blanket they abandoned while dreaming about running uphill. Someone else is awake. Your neighbor's cough walks past your wall like a man with errands. You say a prayer into the pillow that smells like old wool and the family you keep alive with it. There are useful things to do in the middle. You mend by firelight with eyes that learn to squint before they learn to read. You tell a story quiet enough to slip under the door and keep watch in the lane. You and your spouse talk in the hush about grain and gossip, about whether the pig looks too thoughtful, about whether the snow will remember to come slow this year. Sometimes there is pleasure, the sleepy, smiling kind that would embarrass a troubadour, because troubadours adore exaggeration and you prefer accuracy. Intimacy is another way of warming toes. Then there is a psalm, murmured for a child whose lungs are arguing, or for a neighbor who is halfway through winter and already out of patience. You are not a monk, but the night makes everyone sound holy if they whisper long enough. The world beyond the walls is a rumor you test cautiously. On nights when the moon fails to file the proper paperwork, the lane is a tunnel of wet velvet. Ice grows teeth at the water bucket's rim and tests them on your fingers if you forget to be polite. The woods at the edge of the fields are a bad idea that bends close to your ear and suggests possibilities. Wolves exist more in stories than in lanes where you live, but stories have sharp claws in winter. A fox passes like a thought you almost had. An owl drops the punctuation of a mouse's last sentence. Silence resumes. If you must go out, because a birth ignores bells, because a death ignores curfew, because a cow thinks midnight is an excellent time for drama, you go in twos or threes, sticks in hand, names of saints in mouth. Lantern if there's fat to spare, which there usually isn't. Watch is not a job, it's a neighborhood hobby enforced by fear. Men take turns when trouble has been friendly lately. A shutter rattles too much. A loose cart wheel frames a hallelujah when the wind gets enthusiastic. The dog composes essays about nothing. The watchers walk, boots arguing with frozen ruts, and tap on shutters if smoke seems too intimate with thatch. If strangers come, They do not wear signs that say strangers. They wear cloaks and the posture of men who think they are owed. The watchers clear throats and produce names. The Lord, the Reeve, God, the Bell. Names are currency. They spend them like people who have counted their coins. Most nights, the only invader is cold. It conquers edges first, ears, fingers, the part of your face you forget to cover when you grin at a joke you remembered late. Inside, the night thinks in circles. The baby wakes as if the moon pulled a string threaded through a rib. You sway, you hum nonsense. You become a boat on a very small sea that sloshes between the hearth and the bed. The child sighs and surrenders the way kings never do. Your oldest wakes from a nightmare about school, which for them is a place where letters bite, and the priest pats your head like a saint who does not want more statues. You tell them a new alphabet made of animals you actually own. A is for ass, loud and honest. C is for chicken, disloyal but productive. D is for dog, who votes yes on everything. They laugh and fall back into sleep that will forget to be kind in the morning, but at least it is sleep. Time, indoors at least, is measured by fire and by fat. A rushlight burns down so fast you could feed it into its own shadow. A candle makes an hour visible in the way a rich man makes charity visible, sparingly, but it helps. Sometimes you pace the floorboards between the creaks that live beneath your feet and pretend you can count minutes by steps. Sometimes you listen to water drop from the eaves at the rhythm of patience. The rooster, if confused by the moon, declares morning at 3 intervals. Now, not yet, and why are you like this? You throw him a curse that you will apologize for at dawn when he eats beetles from your stump like payment.
Dreams in winter come in heavy clothes. The mind, warmed by stew and cooled by drafts, stages plays with too many costumes. You dream of summer wheat bending like a congregation that agrees with itself. You dream of doors that shut properly and latches that mind their own business. You dream of bread that cuts itself and a fire that tends you. Sometimes the dream is a person you miss. They sit at the edge of your bed and smell like the smoke you once shared and tell you the right plot for the seeds you will argue with in March. You wake with a wet face and an opinion about onions that lasts until breakfast. Fear is thrifty. It reuses props. The hearth glows red beneath ash, and your mind decides it is an eye. The bean creaks like an old man bending and becomes an old man bending who is, obviously, right behind you. You know it is wood. You also know it is something else right up until you touch it and get a splinter that reminds you how absolute wood can be. You are not foolish enough to scoff at ghosts. Scoffing tempts them. You are not foolish enough to court them. Courting tempts them more. You keep a sprig of rowan hung by the door, an herb sachet in the bed, a prayer carved on the inside of the lintel with the knife you use for cheese. Hedge wisdom and church wisdom take turns. Both prefer clean hands and good intentions. Birth ignores weather reports. The midwife is fetched when the moon has already declared her shift over. She arrives with a bag that smells like the whole hedge condensed and a mouth that gives orders that even men obey. The room becomes a hot, loud argument with nature. Water boils when it is told. The fire is bribed with extra wood. The neighbors hover without hovering, the way people do when they want to be useful but refuse to be in the way. A cry splits the night like lightning that elects to stay. You feel the village exhale. On the coldest nights, a new voice is the warmest thing a house can own. The midwife wraps the baby and then instructs the father to go outside and stare at the stars to remind himself he is very small and therefore manageable. He does as he is told. He returns manageable. Death obeys fewer instructions. Sometimes it chooses the night because sorrow has a better echo in the dark. A candle is lit, then another, and the room becomes a chapel without asking permission. Prayers happen with the voices people actually possess, not the ones they borrow in church.
The body is washed with hands that have washed children and floors and wounds and pots, and therefore know their work. A wain will creak toward the church in the morning, and the frost will lay down a white cloth on the ground as if the earth were attempting reverence. Tonight, people come and sit and do the best thing people can do. They take turns being quiet together. Winter is longer than patience, and yet the night finds ways to break itself into pieces you can handle. There is the hour for stories, when the old man remembers a frost that made sound like glass learning to sing. And you suspect he exaggerates, but you need the exaggeration more than you need accuracy. There is the hour for checking traps that catch nothing but your shadow. There is the hour for writing your name with a finger on the fog of a shutter, and then erasing it, because names are not for windows. There is the hour for rehearsing an argument with the miller that you will not win tomorrow, but will enjoy performing anyway. The cold thinks it invented cruelty. You disagree politely with tricks. You warm stones, you share beds, you invent games that involve hands under blankets and questions with long answers. You teach the children to breathe warm into their mittens and then put their mittens on before any heat escapes, as if warmth were a clever captive. You wrap your head and look like a saint who retired early. You keep a kettle murmuring, not for tea you cannot afford, but for air that forgets to crack your throat. You lay your cloak over the foot of the bed where cold sneaks in like a bureaucrat and presented with paperwork it cannot ignore. Outside, the lanes sometimes glow, not with moon, but with snow arguing with the sky. In the white, sound travels differently, as if voices wear cloaks too. You hear the river gossiping under glass. You hear a cart from far beyond the next bend, long before its wheels announce the need for oil. You hear an owl ask a stupid question and answer it himself. You recognize neighbors by the cadence of their boots. The reeve has a stride that believes in measuring. The smith's step rings. The widow's gait is careful and clever. You wave through shutters. They wave through shutters. Privacy is measured in layers, not walls. When sleep returns, it does so suddenly, like a debt collector deciding you've suffered enough. You snuff the rushlight with wet fingers, which makes a sound as satisfying as finishing a job you did not want to start. The bed welcomes you back like a dog who forgave you for everything 15 minutes ago. Straw settles, a blanket resettles at the persuasion of your knee. Bodies align as if choreographed by years of practice. Second sleep is heavier. Dreams are fewer and kinder. Your last thought is practical. Tomorrow, you must split the better log, borrow your neighbor's auger, and return her pot with a turnip in it, so the returning is less embarrassing. Your second to last thought is unpractical. For one breath, you would like to be rich enough to be bored by comfort. Then a pleasant nothing rises and lowers over your eyes like a curtain. Dawn does not so much arrive as insist. The rooster corrects his earlier drafts with revisions shouted directly at your window. The fire, expertly banked, is warm-hearted enough to forgive your neglect. You stretch in the small theater of your bed and listen to all the night left behind for you. A thin crust of ice in the bucket that cracks like gossip. A strand of frost ferns on the lintel, the faint ribbon of heat still trapped under the wool where your feet plan to be brave again. The night's stories shrink in morning's pocket. The shelf of chores has refilled itself to the brim. You sit up, older by one night, which in winter counts as 2 lessons and 3 victories. The country of night stamps your passport and lets you back into day. Cold made you cautious. Night made you cunning. Between them, you learned a craft the rich believe is a virtue only when they are applauding peasants. Endurance without self-pity. You do not call it that. You call it lighting the fire and getting on with it. You survived the longest hours with a handful of old tricks and one new one you invented at midnight when the ash refused to be coaxed. You will teach it to your child tonight, after the curfew bell, while the dog gives public comment and the moon considers whether your roof is worth visiting. You will show them where to press the poker, where to lift the rushlight, where to hide the emergency loaf, where to listen for the house's slow, approving breath. Time is a beast you harness with rope made of habits. You don't own it, you don't tame it. But if you hitch it correctly to the cart of your days, it will drag you around the year without throwing you too often into ditches. The calendar lives in your bones more than in your head. It speaks in calves born and hedges greening, in the first gnat you slap and the last spark you bank. The priest has a book with saints that elbow each other for space. You have a field with moods that change their minds whenever rain remembers it has opinions. You bow to both, because it costs less than arguing. Late winter leans toward spring like a drunk toward a door. The ground is still hard enough to be rude, but you can smell the water thinking about leaving. You step into the lane and it tries to steal your shoes by pretending to be solid. You yank one foot free and pretend you meant to hop. In the hedges, catkins wag their soft little flags as if they are campaigning for hope. You shake your head because hope has never paid rent. Still, you check the stored seed the way a miser checks coins, touching each bag as if it might lie. You pick pebbles from where mice have written their tiny letters and replace the tied strings with tighter. In a corner, potatoes blink in the dark like guilty saints. You smile at their eyes and plan arguments. Before the plow even touches soil, there is mending, the annual litany of should have done this in autumn. You drag the plow from its lean-to with the solemnity of a judge who forgot his wig. The iron share is blunt from the last season's stones. You carry it to the smith, who pretends to be exhausted by the idea of you and then becomes cheerful because iron is easier to convince than people. He hammers until the metal remembers it has an edge. You carry it home hot enough to bully your palms through the cloth. The oxen look at you with the unflappable gloom of philosophers. Their hooves need trimming, their yokes need padding, their bellies need hay that doesn't exist, but will if you stop sulking and fetch it. Plowing is a conversation between stubborns. The soil, still sullen from frost, resists the blade like a peasant resists a tithe. You lean your weight, you coax, you curse, you encourage the ox by name as if it were a child considering disobedience. The line wavers, you pretend it was intentional. After 2 furrows, your shoulders think you took up a new career without informing them. The earth's smell lifts like old bread warmed, the first honest perfume of the year. Birds show up for the banquet of worms and praise your agriculture by singing at a volume that would get them fined in a city. You stop pretending this is only work and lil. It is not joy, it is relief with better posture. Sewing happens with a rhythm your hand learned before your tongue learned to be polite. A dip into the sack, a step, a swing of the arm, grain scattering like future gossip. You walk your land as if you are teaching it to read. Behind you, the harrow scratches across your footprints like a sensor. In your pocket, you've hidden the best kernels, superstition disguised as agroagronomy. You sow them last, around the edges, a rumor for the field to think about. You whisper a saint's name under your breath, and another name that isn't in the book, the one you inherited from a grandmother who had her own calendar and never shared it with priests. Above, the sky pretends to be consistent. You ignore it. The sky is a notorious liar. Spring gets loud. The lambs arrive with knees made of arguments, and the children are deputized to keep them from discovering the garden in a single afternoon. Calves wobble into reality like ideas no one dared to suggest. The hens restart their engine and lay as if they had reputations to repair. You collect eggs with 2 hands and the posture of a diplomat. The hen pecks anyway, filing a complaint that she has repeated since Eden and will repeat until trumpets. The garden demands attention. You weed in the narrow space between showers and pretend the nettles didn't win last year. Your hands remember the sting and the cure, and the part of your mind that believes in balance nods, as if a sting without a cure were an offense against the universe. By May, you have mud in geometries you never intended and sunburn in places that shock you. You attend the blessing of the fields, a procession that makes even the cynical walk softly. The cross goes first, trailed by boys with very serious faces, girls who have been warned not to run and will forget, a priest whose voice fights wind and wins only sometimes, neighbors who leave their grudges on the far side of the ditch because grudges trip people when they are trying to go in straight lines. Holy water salts the edges of your world. Even the birds look impressed. You do not expect miracles, you expect weather. The prayer is for patience and good drainage. Summer is harvest rehearsals and then harvest itself, as if the year's third act insisted on being an opera. The hay must be cut when it is cut and not a moment later, or the sky will spit on your plans. You swing a scythe that the grindstone taught to be reasonable, and the grass falls with a sound like cloth whispering. The field becomes a green sea with waves you can stack. Children in lines, rakes in hands, jokes borrowed from men who claimed them first, and the smell of drying that turns the valley into a bakery of grass. You stack, you thatch the stacks, you move as if movement itself were a shin-bone saint. A storm threatens from the west. The village becomes suddenly faster than sin. You beat the rain by the width of a shrug. You cheer as if you just argued a dragon into therapy. The grain ripens into seriousness, heads heavy with mathematics, and the fields go from green to lion. You sharpen the sickles and invite everyone you have ever borrowed anything from. Harvest is a population event. You cut and pass and gather and bind, and the air fills with a chaff that sits on your skin like a second, more confident skin. Sweat learns to taste like pride. A child yelps because a straw bit them. You remind them that straw has teeth in August and they must keep their ankles at a respectful distance. The stacks rise. The threshing ground prepares for its season of beating the point out of everything. Flails escalating gossip into truth, grain into sacks, bread into the future. You count while pretending not to count. You sleep by falling over. All those months the cold did not die. It merely edited its tone. Even in heat, you think of winter as a creditor with a good memory. You stash fuel because fire eats constantly and indifferently. You stitch spare hours into the seams of days. Another armful of wood carried in the wrong direction around the cottage twice because the dog distracted you and you forgot what you were doing. A bundle of kindling collected and tied with twine that had ambitions to be a halter. A visit to the coppice that is not yours but is everybody's under rules that are strict, generous, and undocumented. You win arguments with brambles by inventing new swear words. You lose arguments with midges and pay them with blood. Autumn arrives dressed as a merchant with a faint smile. Apples ripen with more personality than you can store. You lay them on shelves with their good side up, a vanity they will repay with 1 week of virtue before they begin to soften into philosophy. The pig argues with windfalls by volunteering to judge their ripeness with his teeth. You pick damsons until your hands are stained like a saint's robe in a story where someone was careless with a miracle. You scald jars like enemies and trap summer inside them with wax and willpower. Smoke returns to the village like a relative who has stories and bad shoes. The evenings grow polite, and then chilly, and then rude. You adjust where you sit on the bench by the fire and tell yourself you were always this fond of wool. You pay everyone, because autumn is when accounting requires witnesses. The Lord Steward arrives with a bored expression and an accurate list. You deliver the agreed part of your labor and harvest to the manorial store and the church, a tenth for God, a piece for the oven you borrowed, a favor for the neighbor who brought his taller ladder and did not drop it on your wife's foot. It is not that you are generous, it is that the visage's memory is the only savings account that pays out in blizzards. The tithe barn swallows your measure like a good mouth swallows scripture, with discipline and a small sigh. You come home lighter and tell yourself lightness is oxygen, not loss. You are sometimes correct.
Your body instructs you in fashions it did not request. Hands thicken, knuckles like knots in wood that will not straighten even for weddings. Your back develops the alphabet of stoop and stretch, the letters that spell out work and are indecipherable to anyone who has never hauled water in February. The eyes, oh, the eyes learn the mischief of dusk when chores pretend to be finished and then remember themselves. Your knees attend church out of habit, because kneeling while the priest tests a discourse in Latin is ironically easier than standing while a pig refuses to leave the gate. You sleep hard, and yet sometimes your dreams put you back in a field under a sun that believed in you. Time with children collapses and expands like soufflé. They are infants when the plow turns, walking when the bean poles go up, talking in time with the first ripened strawberry. They ask why hay must dry, and you explain weather and greed. They ask
Why the priest's robe is green sometimes and red other times, and you explain seasons and saints and how colors help God keep track of us. They ask why the moon follows the cart at night, and you explain that the moon enjoys gossiping. They ask why their toes are cold, and you explain physics disguised as a story about wind that got lost and wandered into the house by mistake. You watch their legs lengthen. You measure their height against the same beam in the cottage. You pretend you are not surprised every time the mark rises. There are days the year laughs at your plans. Rain overreaches and the stream becomes ambitious. The Ford argues with carts. A wheel cracks and the repair steals an afternoon you had already spent in your head on threshing. The wind decides to try your roof on like a hat. You stand on the ladder and shout at the sky because you cannot reach it. Lightning writes its signature on the hill and starts a fire where no fire belongs. The village runs uphill with the sincere stupidity of courage and beats it with green branches until the hill admits to being damp. Somewhere, a sow farrows early. You spend 3 hours arguing with piglets who think life is optional. You win barely and count it loudly. Not everything you plant obeys the book. The beans climb the poles with more opinion than grace, and you find yourself counseling them at dusk. The beets misunderstand the concept of size and attempt to be subtle. Cabbages do what cabbages do, become themselves at volume. A late frost sneaks in and sketches lace on the last of the peas. You call it art and then cuss it. You put straw around the fragile things and mutter to the weather as if it were a dog who has tipped the bucket again. Some mornings you step outside and the world smells like a clean shirt. Some mornings it smells like a damp argument. You work either way because work is the only thing here that keeps promises. You age in loops. You remember a spring when you could carry 2 sacks without telling anyone about it later. You notice you now tell everyone about carrying 1. The children roll their eyes, which is the surest sign your stories have achieved immortality. The old man at the bake oven claimed winters used to be winters, and you nod respectfully because exaggeration is a vitamin in the elderly diet. You give them your place near the hot bricks because their bones learned arithmetic in a century that counted differently. You take the outside edge of the bench for yourself and tell your thighs to be reasonable. They laugh. You forgive them. Travel threads through seasons like a needle that forgets to stop. You go to the market in spring with a basket that keeps changing its mind about being empty. You carry eggs in a stubborn hope. You return with salt and a rumor, which is a fair exchange. In summer, you escort a pig to a cousin downriver and discover that pigs have firm opinions on the concept of escort. The road treats you like a toy and the sun treats you like laundry. In autumn, you go to a fair 2 villages away and try to remember which stall sold the knives that didn't lie. In winter, you mostly stay because roads grow teeth and the fields would miss your insults. What looks like monotony from far away, from a future with thermostats and chairs that recline without cracking, is in fact 1,000 variations on necessity. Morning feels different in March than in October because the light has a different kind of impatience. The wind in January is a judge. In June, it's a gossipy aunt who knows everyone's laundry habits. The same walk to the same well is a pilgrimage when you carry bad news, and an errand when you carry bread for a friend.
You are always doing the same work and you are never doing the same work. The difference is tiny and total. And there are the small, unplanned feasts that stitch the year together when saints and lords look away. A pie appears because a neighbor borrowed your oven and returned it with gratitude that smelled of cinnamon she swears she cannot afford. A birthday sneaks up on a child who counts by lambs instead of months. Someone presents a whistle made from elder that speaks 2 notes and 1 joy. A traveler leaves behind a scrap of song that fits your steps so well you hum it for a month and decide it was always yours. You taste honey that happened 2 fields over and pretend the bees preferred your clover. You take your spouse's hand on a path you have walked 1,000 times and notice the hedge learned a new trick with light. When winter circles back with its ledger and its eyebrows, you have receipts. The wood is stacked taller than a lie. The grain is honest and guarded. The blankets remember last year and have been promoted. The roof has learned humility and decided to keep water on the correct side mostly. The pig has reached its inevitable conclusion and become a series of future dinners. The children have at least 1 garment that is longer than they are. The dog has decided to be useful after sundown. You look at the cottage in the early dark and it looks back. Not proud, not pretty, but ready. That is all you ever asked. And on the coldest night, because this is how the year trains you, you call up every month to help. January lends you its stubbornness. February sends you a habit of counting down. March offers you that green whisper you put under the door to teach the draft manners. April bequeaths a joke. May, a song. June, the patience to lie very still and let warmth find you. July, the memory of sweat. August, the sound of grain falling. September, a jar that still smells like sun. October, the courage to carry heavy things. November, the art of goodbyes that are not surrender. December, the practice of lighting and tending without boasting. You pile them on like layers and lie there in the dark, warm in a way that isn't temperature, but testimony. You have survived another circle. You will do it again, because you have made a career out of doing it again.
Hospitality in winter is a doctrine, not a mood. Roads grow fangs, and yet people still move. Because babies insist on appearing in inconvenient villages and monks insist on owning relics, you promised yourself you would visit before your knees invented weather. When strangers trudge into your lane with frost in their eyebrows and politeness in their pockets, you do the arithmetic of kindness and fuel. You have not got enough wood to warm the whole world, but you have enough to warm a pair of hands. You open the door. The room inhales a stranger and exhales steam off their cloak. For one night, you convert hunger into portions and straw into floor space, and you discover that generosity is much cheaper when measured in sleep rather than stew. The parish runs on small alms and large gossip. In deep cold, the church wardens remember which old men grumble louder because their blankets are lies. A loaf appears, with 2 extra slices pretending to be for the child. An ember is carried in a lidded pan from house to house like a visiting relic, except this relic starts fires instead of preventing them. The charity you give today is a debt you hope to collect when your own fire sulks and your own roof tries humility by dropping snow into your bowl. No one writes this down. The ledger is a whisper and a memory. It is accurate. You pass the monastery when the lane consents to be a lane. Monks are winter rich, not because they hoard warmth, but because they hoard habits. They keep hours whether the sun remembers to show up or not. Their bell cuts the day into slices you can actually swallow. The guest hall smells like wood that has been told to behave and bread that learned classical Latin. You trade your news for their soup, which tastes like vegetables raised in a garden that prays even when it's weeding. In the infirmary, a brother with careful eyes shows you a syrup that will make a cough consider a career change. You do not ask what it is made of. He does not tell you. You both enjoy the fiction that medicine is mystery and not simply boiled plant plus hope.
At Candlemas, the whole village flirts with light. You bring what you can afford, to be wax and tallow and gilt, and the priest blesses flames as if they were parishioners. Candles stand in ranks, like little saints waiting for assignments. All year they will be spent sparingly. Births, deaths, storms, a night when fear wears boots. Beeswax is summer embalmed. You save it for the faces you love so that their features are lit with kindness. Tallow is honest and a little cruel. It smokes, it drips, it smells like obligation. You use it anyway because the alternative is darkness, and darkness is a convincer you don't like to argue with. You read weather like scripture, hunting for footnotes in the sky. A ring around the moon means moisture is writing a letter. A red dawn means the day will be an attitude problem. Smoke that refuses to climb means you will breathe your own mistakes for an hour unless you open a window and argue with frost instead. The dog's coat says something. The cow's breath says something else. A crow facing west is a hypothesis. A wind from the east is a verdict. There are proverbs for all of this, and you repeat them, not because they are always correct, but because saying them out loud reminds the sky that you are watching. The sky behaves a little better when watched. Cold forces engineering on people who did not ask to be engineers. You grease axle pins so the cart does not scream in the lane like a murdered violin. You throw a sledge on the frost and discover the night owes you smoothness. You braid straw sandals to slide over shoes that have decided to imitate lakes. You learn the miracle of layers. Linen to drink sweat, wool to negotiate, leather to veto. You hang a wet cloak near the hearth and leave enough distance that it dries instead of learning spontaneous combustion. You place a board as a threshold to bully drafts into tripping. You discover that a door you can shove open with a shoulder is better than one that seals like a rich man's purse. Oxygen is a theology. Travel in winter is less a journey than a series of negotiations. The inn at the crossroads is not an inn so much as a room that consents to be loud for money. Beds are a rumor, floors are a truth. People sleep arranged like punctuation. Periods against the wall, commas near the hearth, question marks in the middle who can't get comfortable. A girl with a pitcher refills cups with ale that tastes like bread that wanted a vacation. A trader retells Rome to anyone who will pay in onions. A pilgrim insists his badge is authentic while it leaks pewter onto his cloak. You keep one hand on your bundle and the other on your patience. In the morning, you leave with fewer fleas than last time and a song you dislike, which means you will sing it until spring. Sometimes, because the saints are bored, you walk on water. Rivers freeze into mirrors that prefer to lie. The first step sounds like a small sermon, confident, short. You test each foot as if the river is an audience that might heckle. The ice sings to itself, a wail in a dream. Halfway across, you remember that you promised 3 separate saints you would never do this, and that your promises are only as good as your memory. You keep your eyes on the opposite bank. You refuse to look down. Your breath hands you warnings in little clouds. You arrive. You thank water and physics and pride. You pretend you were never worried. You lie convincingly. The manor does its winter paperwork. The reeve counts pigs, hens, and a goat that refuses to be accurately categorized. The court sits in the Lord's Hall, its rafters collecting smoke and decisions. Presentments are read, ditches that failed to be ditches, hedges that wandered, men who hunted in woods that were not theirs. Fines fall like icy rain. You pay in coin if you are foolish, and in labor if you are practical. Everyone nods gravely when the assize of ale is recited, especially the alewife Who is likely to break it tomorrow? Justice is not blind, it is merely short-sighted and wearing a hood. Health in winter is a truce you negotiate nightly. You keep a pot of onions in a pot of water and hope. You steep time until the house smells like a hillside in June and pretend smell can cure throats. You line chests with warmed cloth and whisper to lungs as if they were children who got out of bed after curfew. The wise woman knocks and asks questions like a detective. When did the cough begin? What color is the spit? What did you dream before the fever? She leaves you with a bitter brew and a set of rules. No drafts, no shouting, no neighbors with new ideas about miracles. You obey if you want to. You disobey if you must. Sometimes the body decides, sometimes the herb does. Cold invites faith to sit closer to the fire. Saints multiply. Their specialties become family gossip. Saint Blaise minds throats. Saint Nicholas minds children and sailors, which is inconvenient because you own neither, but you light a candle anyway because you like his face. Saint Brigid minds flames and cows, and therefore deserves most of your time. When the wind roars, you think of Saint Christopher, and of the bridge you avoided, and you promise to be better tomorrow. The priest disapproves of how intimately you talk to saints as if they were neighbors, then goes home and asks St. Lawrence to mind his kitchen. The holy and the homely sit together and share a bowl. Stories thicken when the air thins. The winter giants stomp at the edge of the wood, and everyone knows someone whose cousins saw their footprints. Night walkers wander lanes that are actually cattle. A white stag appears in more tales than fields. You do not believe any of it properly. You repeat all of it properly. Children listen with their mouths open. Old men listen with their mouths closed. Women correct details. The dog decides at random intervals that the corner is alive and must be barked at decisively. You allow it. Barking is a winter sport. When the wind is mean and a door draftier than confession, you spill the games onto the table to weigh the night down. Knucklebones clatter. A board scratched with lines pretends to be a battlefield and keeps the peace. Dice warn you about luck. You cheat the children and then confess, not because your soul depends on it, but because their laughter does. A tune winds through the room and knots itself around a verse everyone actually knows. Your spouse harmonizes with the kettle. Someone invents a rhyme about the miller's hat and no one ever forgives them for it because now it refuses to leave your head. Cold teaches you to praise small heat like a deity. There's the heat that climbs into a bowl into your face. There's the heat that lives in a dog's flank and tolerates your toes.
There is the heat trapped in the tight cup between your palms when you hold them under your armpits for a count of 20 because you were smart before you were comfortable. There is the heat of embarrassment when you slip on the lane and pretend you were kneeling to look at the frost. There is the heat of anger when the door refuses to latch, and then the heat of triumph when a piece entwine and a wedge persuaded to behave. Worship is a collection of moments you decide not to forget. You inventualize your winter like a merchant who dislikes numbers. Wood, enough if no one gets sentimental about large flames. Grain, sufficient if soup maintains its democratic instincts. Salt, a handful that you count so often it wears a groove in your hope. Candles, 4 proper, 7 scandalous scraps that will be remelted into optimism. Rushes on the floor, old enough to vote, replaced soon in a ceremonial rite of sweeping that doubles as spring cleaning and triples as archaeology. Socks, always fewer than feet because socks enjoy hiding. Confidence, refilled nightly by routine. Modern people would call what you do mindfulness,
which is funny because your mind is full whether you approve or not. You listen to the way wind talks down the chimney, lecture, not argument, and you decide that tonight it will not be allowed to win. You count your breaths because they are warm and yours, and because numbers are domesticated. You imagine a beach you will never see, and then you imagine a fat pig in a future stew because visualization must be practical to be useful. You tell your body to relax parts it forgot it owns: eyebrows, jaw, shoulders, the small muscles that hold your opinion of the world. You are good at obedience when you are the commander. Caution is a winter hobby. Braziers are treacherous suitors. You keep them outside, or you let the door gossip with the night so air can behave. You sweep the hearth until sparks feel unwelcome like kings in a republic. You set the poker in the same place every evening because midnight is not the hour to negotiate with iron in the dark. You teach the little ones that wool sparks less than linen because future fires start with curiosity. You keep a bucket by the door because water solves more disputes than Latin. You say goodnight to the thatch. It does not answer, which you take as a good sign. And then there are the show-off nights, the ones that will become anecdotes for 20 winters. The frost paints ferns on the door lintel, delicate as the embroidery on the priest's best cope, and you hesitate to breathe because breath would vandalize art. The sky snaps into a black so clean it squeaks. The stars look like holes into a warmer place. The dog decides loudly that the east is unsafe. You step outside because cold is also theater, and you have tickets. Your nose burns and forgives. Your eyelashes carry crystals like a saint's reliquary. Your ears learn humility. The snow answers the moon with opinions so bright you can read your name scratched last week in the shutter greases. For 2 minutes, you are an astronomer, a philosopher, a saint. Then your toes speak, and you go back inside to become a person. Inside, you arrange the bodies of your household like chess pieces built of heat. The king is a king in peril, and therefore tucked between bishops, grandparents, and rooks, parents, while the knights, older children, kick in their sleep. The dog is the queen because he moves wherever he likes and is always somehow central. The blanket is policy. You tuck, you negotiate, you threaten to revoke foot privileges. Everyone pretends to be offended and then immediately sleeps because offense is exhausting. Finally, the thing you avoid naming but always perform. You thank the day for not killing you. This is not melodrama. A spilled bucket could have frozen an ankle. A careless ember could have sold the roof to the sky. A fever could have finished a sentence you didn't want ended. None of that happened. You tear the ash, you pinch the rushlight, you settled into the share of straw that knows your spine. The house breathes, the oxen breathe, the fire breathes. You breathe. Small heat collects like coins in a jar you never count. You close your eyes and deposit another coin. You survive the coldest nights, not as a hero in a poem, but as a clerk of persistence. You write the same line over and over, bank the fire, stack the wood, share the bed, stir the pot, laugh before the laughing freezes, light the candle when the candle matters, darken the room when the dark is gentler than smoke. You cross out mistakes, you write the line again. In the morning, there will be boots that need their soles argued back into place, and pigs with theological concerns, and a lane that will shock you by being ordinary. For now, there is a room that is not as cold as outside, and you are in it, and that is a chapter.
Winter keeps lessons in reserve,
the way a strict teacher keeps a switch behind her chair even on days when she smiles. You think you know the routine by now. Bank the fire, fold the blanket, ration the woodpile with a miser's grace. But then a night arrives with a colder soul than the rest, and everything you have learned is examined under a harsher lamp. The dog has no jokes. The door's breath is a ghost. The well has decided to be a sculpture. Even your thoughts put on coats before they venture out into your mouth. You are not frightened, you are irritated. Fear comes later if you let it. Irritation is a better fuel. You begin 3 hours before dark, which in this season is also known as mid-afternoon. Wood is sorted the way generals sort men. Quick to light, steady to last, sullen but useful, unreliable and therefore placed near the door where disappointment belongs. You turn the stack into a choreography. The smallest pieces flirt with the flame, the larger weight with the dignity of saints who know their turn will come. The poker becomes a baton, and you, a conductor of combustion. Sparks rise and settle on the stone hearth, brief planets discovering gravity. You keep a pot just off the boil, because hot water is winter's only polite surprise. You walk the cottage like a captain, inspecting a ship before weather. The shutter's latch gets an extra twist of cord. The moss in the door seam is persuaded to believe in destiny. The hole above the hearth, call it a louver, call it a skylight that resents that name, is adjusted in increments, a negotiation between smoke and warmth that would exhaust a city council. You hold your palm near the crack and read the wind's minutes. You pull the bed half a foot farther from the wall where the north rehearses tragedies. A curtain on a cord is dragged across a space that used to be just a space and is now a border. The house nods in all its timbers and pretends approval. Supper is not extravagant, but it is intentional. Oats and onions, a shred of meat if the pig in the salt barrel consents to share a memory of himself, thyme crushed with a stone that looks like it has been judging you for years. The broth grows thick enough to slow a spoon. The steam fogs the shutter and writes its own undecipherable alphabet. You tune the pot with salt the way a cautious musician tunes a lute. One pinch too far and it will sing the wrong key all night. You tear bread and hand it around with ceremony, because ceremony scolds the cold into standing at the back of the room. The children burn their tongues and are pleased by it. You burn yours and pretend to be wiser. The animals receive a speech. Not because they understand, but because saying things out loud creates a weather inside you that the outside weather must respect. No births tonight, you inform the cow. No arguments, you advise the pig. No politics, you tell the chickens, who are already embroiled in a scandal with the roost. The dog gets a blanket he pretends not to need, and then claims with an injured dignity that fools no one. The cat chooses the spot nearest the heat and presents his belly to the fire like a pagan altar. You accept this with the same resignation with which you accept taxes in saints. Some authorities cannot be discussed. Outside, the lane loses its claim to being a lane and becomes a logic problem, a smoothness that hides events. You step out to fetch the last of the wood, and the world tries to make you a lesson. Your foot slides, you invent a prayer that combines 3 saints and a curse the priest would admit is efficient, and you remain upright through sheer contempt. The sky has become glass, thin and brittle, and the moon is a cold coin frozen onto it. Every sound carries with a crispness that would please a scribe. You hear your neighbor cough as if he were at your shoulder. You hear a horse stamp in a byre as if it were in your chest. You hear your own breath and decide it is too loud for this weather and moderate it. Back inside, the house is an ark, loaded with the second best of everything. The best you have saved for later or already used, that is the truth of years. But second best wool still warms, second best bench still holds, second best stories still end where they should. You place warmed stones at the foot of the bed and wrap them like truths intact. The children fight over nothing, and then over a corner of blanket, and then over who is allowed to be brave first. You sort them the way a baker sorts loaves, far from the draft, close to the heat,
and with enough distance between them that they rise instead of collide. The curfew bell drifts over the fields with a sound like ice thinking. You nod to it. The rushlight's flame discovers its own pessimism and demands trimming. You oblige, and the light grows competent again. You go through the pockets of your day and remove the items that should not go to bed with you. A worry about the miller's accounts, a resentment toward wind, a joke you plan to tell the reeve, and then decide you like living too much for that joke tonight. You fold them on a shelf where morning can find them and ruin them as it usually does. You keep the thought that your house, for all its leaks and creaks, is a warm argument against the night. You keep that close. Stories circulate with the steam from the pot. You tell the one about your grandmother who claimed February was just a bureaucrat and could be bribed with pancakes. The children, scandalized and hungry, examine the larder with their eyes. You do not have pancakes. You have an anecdote and a loaf. You tell the one about the time the river decided to be a road, and everyone pretended it was normal until the ice remembered its job and someone's cart remembered gravity. You tell the quiet story about a candle that burned through a vigil without once dripping on the sheet. The old man in the corner, who was not there 5 minutes ago and now is because neighbors in winter are like saints everywhere suddenly, adds a story about a shepherd who sheltered a king without knowing and learned nothing from it except that kings snore. Sleep is not an event, it is a series. First comes the pretense of sleep. Everyone lying still and remembering grievances the way a miser counts coins, slowly, twice. Then comes the decision to forgive the night for being cold, because the alternative is a new argument every minute. You all agree, silently, to be warm together instead of cold separately. It is not noble, it is practical. You arrange feet like an architect who has studied caves. The baby's breath is a metronome. The fire's heart glows like a confession under ash. Someone snores. You prepare a reasonable insult and decide to save it, like salt, for later. You waken to the intermission, the old customary crack between sleeps, and the cottage is a different country. The rushlight shows you a world with fewer edges. The steam has left the pot and become law in the air. You step to the hearth and lift the ash like you lift a blanket from a child's face to make sure hope still lives there. Red reveals itself as if it were shy. You feed it with a sliver of dry wood and a word your grandmother taught you, which might be a prayer, might be a curse, might be a recipe. The flame answers without asking for theology. Behind you, a child rolls and mutters something about a chicken that owes him an apology. You agree in principle. Sometimes, the coldest nights deliver their own theater. A fox yips out past the field like a gossip who forgot to whisper. The frost on the inside of the shutter grows ferns so perfect that you would eat them if they would taste like they look. The thatch pops one voice then another as ice concedes and falls in a hush like respect. You step outside to the necessary place, and the world is a cathedral that fired the choir and kept only the architecture. Your breath becomes incense. The stars sit in their places as if attendance had been taken. You are small and significant, like a spark that remembered to light. Inside again, the second sleep arrives with a heavy hand, but you keep it waiting a moment. There is a habit to perform, the laying out of tomorrow where tomorrow can see it. You set the kindling basket within reach of whoever will wake first and resent it least. You put a bowl and spoon where the half-awake can find them without inventing new language. You tie a loop of cord to the poker so fingers in the dark will know which tool is the helpful one. You put the smallest pair of wool socks at the foot of the bed where the smallest pair of feet will find them and be forced to admit you love them. You allow yourself the uninterrupted arrogance of believing this will help. You are correct. You dream of heat, but not the modern, anonymous kind that pours from a wall like excuses. You dream of very specific heats. The belly of a cow in January dusk, the first mouthful of a stew that finally admitted garlic, the palm of your spouse against the back of your neck when you pretended not to be cold, the sun in July on the exact part of the field where you fell down pretending to rest and actually slept for 8 minutes. the peculiar private heat that lives under a child's hair. You travel and not moved, which is the only kind of travel you can afford tonight. Morning takes its time, but not yours. The rooster rehearses 3 false mornings before settling on an official one. The light arrives the way a shy guest does, peering in, withdrawing, clearing its throat in the lane, then finally stepping across the threshold with a polite apology for being late and not bringing anything. You sit up, and every joint provides minutes from its last meeting with labor. The bucket is frozen again. You crack it, and the sound is a satisfaction you cannot share because everyone who might agree is asleep. The hearth remembers your ash quilt lesson and offers you coals with the generosity of a saint who has learned to budget. You say, "Good hearth,"
out loud, because houses like praise. Breakfast is the arithmetic of the night's success. If the stew thickened into something with backbone, you are ahead. If the bread kept its courage, you are even. If the milk has not sulked, you are rich. You sip, chew, judge, and correct the morning with a handful of decisions. The children are released from the blanket ship as if they are sailors on shore leave. The cold in the lane tests the door. The door pushes back with a hinge that you oiled in October out of superstition and prudence. You open it anyway because the day insists on being met, and you, being stubborn, insist on being the one who meets it first. Neighbors arrive by rumor. Someone saw smoke thinner than it should be and decided to check. Someone else heard the dog be less opinionated than usual. You stand in the doorway with a bowl in your hand and a mild expression on your face that means both gratitude and do not come in with that draft. They nod, the way winter people nod. It looks like a shrug, but is not. You exchange updates as if they were tools, sharp, brief, useful. His cow remembered to calf at a civilized hour. Her roof lost a tile and found 3 neighbors. Old Jory's cough has taken up residence lower in the house than anyone likes. The priest blessed the candles as if he were paying a debt. The lane between you and the oven is a trap today. Use the back way. You nod, and your gratitude is an ember you keep under your tongue where the wind cannot find it. By noon, the night has become a story. Not a legend, not yet. No wolves tried your latch, no soldiers mistook your cottage for a law, but a story with a beginning. Do you remember how the well looked like a saint's reliquary, all glass and righteousness? A middle. We put the bed under a new idea, and it worked. And an end, which is always the same. And we woke up. You store it with the others, the small victories that make a roof out of something other than reeds. The cold will come back at dusk with its clipboard and its questions. But for a few hours you can pretend you were never examined at all. You pretend so well that you convince yourself, which is a useful talent and resembles joy. You don't tell the children that one day they will remember this as warmth. You don't tell yourself that either. Memory wears mittens. It does not always recall cold correctly. What you say is simpler and also true. You did the work, and the work did not betray you. The fire obeyed. The blanket did its job. The soup remembered how to be food. The door remembered which side of the wind is inside. You look at your hands and do not think of saints or heroes. You think of handles and ladles and knots and stitches and ash. You think of how many small obediences add up to survival, and how survival, when stacked high enough, is indistinguishable from comfort in dim light. And during the day, when the sun is pretending to be generous, you do your other winter task. You teach. Not in speeches, because winter eats speeches, but in repetitions disguised as chores. You show the smallest child how to listen for the sound the hearth makes when it wants its ash lifted, and how that sound is different from the sound of pride. You show the older one how to fold the blanket in such a way that warmth waits between layers like a patient animal and springs out when legs dive in. You show your spouse the new trick you learned with the shutter latch so the wind can be kept talking to itself. They show you where you forgot a crack last night. You confess. They forgive. The house approves. By afternoon, you are already building the next night from the scraps of this one. That is the rule. That has always been the rule. You set aside a better chunk of wood. You tuck a secret ember into a clay pot and cover it with ash because sometimes mornings need a scandal to wake them. You talk with your neighbor about the possibility of sharing a watch if the raiders rumored 2 valleys over decide they enjoy walking at night. You measure the last of the salt and laugh. Not because there is plenty, but because laughing at salt makes it behave better than crying at it does. You oil the hinge again even though it does not yet squeak. Prevention is thrift for time. By evening, the world has rearranged itself into the same shapes as yesterday, which is to say, everything is different and nothing is. The frost is coming again. The bell will ring. The door will complain at the first lift and then acquiesce. The pot will do its honest work. Someone will snore. Someone will whisper. Someone will dream of July. Someone will lie with eyes open and count the breaths of the sleeping like coins clinking into a jar. You will be all 4 someones in turn. And again, the night will test what you have built not with drama, but with duration. And again, you will pass, not with grace, but with stubbornness. And again, in the middle of the hardest hour, you will think of people far in the future who will press a button and bathe their rooms in warmth as if heat were a tame animal, and you will envy them briefly and then pity them gently for the things their hands will never learn. The coldest nights are not monsters. They are exams. You do not slay them. You outlast them with a pencil made of ash and a paper made of dark. You answer every question the same way. With wood, with wool, with soup, with company. You put your name at the top and your village at the bottom and the year in the margin. And the year nods and grades you in the morning with a dawn that pretends it was easy. You laugh at the dawn for lying. The dawn forgives you. And the next night, when it comes with its clipboard, you are ready to write again.
The cold arrives like a verdict delivered by a judge you never met and still somehow offended. Not just any cold. Tonight, it is the kind with edges, the kind that files a complaint against breath itself. You feel it first in the door, which has been practicing resistance all season and now gives a little theatrical shudder when you slide the bar, as if to say, "Are you sure?" You are not sure. You never are on nights like this. You are only stubborn, and stubbornness is a fine coat if you keep moving. The curfew bell carries across the valley with a tone so brittle it might crack if you looked at it wrong. You nod because nodding is what you do to bells. They love respect. Behind you, the hearth has been coaxed into the best version of itself. Coals banked under ash like a secret hoarded in the dark. A crown of sticks arranged with ceremony. One honest log ready to become legend. You know the grammar of this fire. It needs no poetry tonight, just obedience and air. You feed it both, gently, the way you would feed excuses to a lord, carefully while keeping your fingers. Wind has been writing letters under your door all afternoon. You answered with moss, old cloth, a wisp of sheep's patience, a wedge cut from a board that used to be a better board. Drafts remain, because drafts are like relatives, always finding a way to visit. You declare a truce. They can haunt the far corner, the one where the stool with 3 ambitions and 1 good leg sulks. You and the children will occupy the bedship, pulled farther from the wall than last night,
turned just so that the blanket's sag becomes a harbor, and the pillow, sack of something once noble, learns manners. The dog discovers he has been assigned to the role of heated stone, and claims it with moral clarity. There is a moment every winter when you can hear cold, not the wind, that is loud and obvious and fond of metaphors, but cold itself, speaking in the high, brittle music of water, turning into something uncooperative. Tonight, the bucket by the door sings a thin note when you touch it with your knuckle. The shutter mutters as a fern of frost sketches itself from the inside out, artistry with bad intentions. The thatch above your head answers with a small, reluctant pop as ice lets go of straw. The house is a choir rehearsing a miserere. You are the beadle with the lamp, walking slowly down the aisle, checking that everyone is prepared to suffer in an orderly fashion. Supper is not soup so much as strategy. Oats become a paste with aspirations. An onion sacrifices itself to the cause. A scrap of pork appears from the barrel like a saint's relic, and dissolves into flavor so thorough it can only be described as forgiveness. You stir clockwise, as you have always stirred, because clockwise is the direction in which time agrees to move, and you want time on your side. You salt carefully, aware that the line between enough and regret is razor thin tonight. Steam rises and kisses faces that suddenly remember summer. Bowls are passed, greedy, reverent. A small burn on the tongue is welcomed like a moral lesson. Yes, yes, be careful. Yes, yes, be grateful. The village is a map of sounds you could draw with your eyes closed. Old Jury's cough concludes its nightly parable 2 doors down. The smith's laugh, big as a furnace, leaks from shutters that never could be persuaded to fit. Somewhere the reeve ties and unties a knot that stands for worry. Farther off, a widow sings, not because she wants to, but because silence would be worse. Between the notes, a thin idea travels. Tonight will be the one. The one that tests foundations, borders, bargains. The one that finds the seam in your patience, the knot in your rope, the crack in your plan. You pretend not to hear the idea. You feed the fire another argument. You tell the children a joke about a rooster who converted to astronomy and started crowing at stars. They laugh in a small, brave way. This is how you polish courage until it thinks it's humor. The first sleep takes you with the authority of a well-practiced thief. Straw adjusts its angles. Wool settles like a decision. The baby fits into the crook of your arm with the exact geometry of mercy. Outside, the lane becomes moon and ice and the rumor of foxes. Inside, the hearth becomes a mind, thinking steady red thoughts. Your last waking act is to pat the ash over the coals the way you would pat a stubborn friend's shoulder. Stay. Then the dark does what it always does. It lowers itself over your eyes with a patient hand. You wake because you always wake. The night has a seam, and you have learned to place your hands on it and pull gently. The room has changed color to that peculiar coal-lit crimson that makes the wooden spoon look like a scepter, and your spouse's hair like a painting of a saint no church would commission. Cold has crept into the routine jobs and made them feel dangerous. The pot has retreated from the glow and sulks. The bucket has declared itself a jewel. The shutter fern has grown into a forest. You listen. The dog is awake, but noble about it. The baby sighs, a sound that would thaw January if January cared about such things. You lift the ash quilt, and the coals answer, faint, as if embarrassed to have been caught dozing. A sliver of kindling, then another, then the breath you learned as a child, steady, confident, not too proud. A flame licks, then thinks better of it, then decides to exist. You hold a twig into the margin of that existence and keep your hands very still, as if you are a priest making a small but important doctrine. The twig becomes permission. The permission becomes fire. The fire becomes your only good decision at this hour. You pretend not to be relieved. The fire knows better. A knock arrives, the kind of knock that has no right to be here because custom demands that men carry their trouble in daylight, where neighbors can see it coming. It is a cautious knock, as if the knuckles themselves are cold and would prefer to be holding a bowl somewhere else. You look at your spouse. Your spouse looks at the dog. The dog decides not to be brave yet. You open the door an inch and receive the weather's argument full in the face. The man in the gap is blue around the mouth and red around the eyes and holding something that whimpers. "Please," he says, and the word makes a little cloud. "Please," and the word is heavier than his breath. You do not ask whose child. The child is small and therefore everybody's. You do not ask why tonight. Nights choose themselves. You do not ask how long. Answers are insults in weather like this. You make the house larger by moving very small things: a stool, a silence, a suspicion. The man staggers in, and the door becomes a wild animal you wrestle back into its frame. The world stays outside, offended. The room inhales and remembers who it is. Your spouse is already at the pot doing sums. What can be stretched? What cannot? What must be stolen from tomorrow and returned with interest in a promise? The child is made of bone and rain. You wrap it in wool and instruction. Breathe, you say to its ribs. Breathe, you say to the man who looks ready to fall through the floor into that cold country no one returns from. Your neighbor appears as if grown from the shutter's fern. No knock this time, only a hand, a face, a scarf too thin for wisdom. She says, "The oven." She doesn't need to finish the sentence. On nights like this, the communal bake changes its job from bread to people. Stone holds heat the way saints hold grudges, for a long time, against all reason. Families have already begun the quiet procession you can hear when you listen for it. The shuffle of boots, the clink of a pot, the murmur of someone telling a child not to touch anything. You look at the man, at the child, at your own, at the dog, at the fire that is both proof and warning. You decide. The journey to the oven is a chant. Layers against the skin. Cloak against layers. Child against heart. Poker set to rights. Embers tucked into a clay pot in case the world ends and must be restarted by a peasant with a good memory. The door tries to prevent your leaving. You are polite but firm. The lane is a single idea. White, flat, treacherous. Sound carries. The river speaks under its lid. A fox argues with his own footprints. Your breath invents ancestors. The bundle in your arms argues faintly with life, which is a good sign. Behind you, your spouse closes the house like a book, leaving it on the right page. The oven is already a manger for grown people. The door, a mouth that eats wood and returns favor, gives out a low flame-bright purr. You count faces the way you count grain. There is the smith, suddenly smaller without his anvil. There is the widow, suddenly larger with 3 children clinging like parentheses. There is the alewife with a vat of something that is probably medicinal if you pray over it. There is a monk, of course, because nights like this shake monks out of the monastery like nuts from a tree. He is holding a candle that behaves like beeswax and a book that behaves like comfort. People make room. People always make room when stone and fire agree to be generous. You lay the child near the warm bricks, as if laying down winter itself to see if it will change its mind. A hand you didn't know you trusted checks the child's breath with 2 fingers and a psalm. The man who brought him sits and makes a sound that is not crying, but is not crying either. You wrap your own in what warmth you carried and what you find. The oven sighs pleasantly, and the village, as one organism, tries to follow suit. For a moment, it works. For a moment, you think, perhaps the worst of the night is outside, arguing with shadows and losing. The door opens again, and Cold walks in wearing a woman who is about to deliver. There is laughter, because of course there is. The timing is comedic if you are cruel, which you are not, and therefore the laughter has the decency to sound like courage. The midwife arrives from somewhere inside the oven's crowd, like a miracle you had the sense to expect. She commandeers the warmest corner and begins to issue orders that even saints would obey. The monk pretends not to blush at practicalities. The men pretend to be useful and are handed tasks until the pretending improves. The oven's mouth becomes the center of a universe the size of a village. Outside, the wind tries to convene a council. Inside, the only politics is heat. It happens slowly and then all at once, as good things and bad things do. Breath returns to the child at the bricks, first in small taxes and then in whole coins. A new cry answers it from the corner where the midwife has just persuaded a human to become a citizen. 2 sounds, like bookends, holding up the shelf of the night. The oven glows, eyes shine. Someone murmurs a blessing and forgets to specify which god should be in charge of it, which is the purest sort of prayer. You feel warmth in your hands that is not entirely from stone. You feel ridiculous for the relief, and ridiculous for the risk, and ridiculous for how well ridiculous suits you. Stall, you tell yourself, because you can feel the revelation edging toward you, and revelations make poor neighbors. Stall. Think about the bricks, their history in the summer sun, the way they drank fire for bread and now spend it freely on skin. Think about the flour on the floor, ghost of harvest turned into footprints. Think about the hook that holds the door open at the perfect angle where heat behaves like a generous man and not like a runaway. Think about the pattern frost drew on the lintel, now melting and making little rivers down into the impressions of hands that have pushed this wood for a century. You extend the moment the way you would stretch stew, slowly, expertly, adding heat and patience until there is enough. The smith tells a story to fill the gap you keep making. He was a boy in a winter that claimed to be worse. Old people always say this. It is an Olympic sport. And the oven cracked with frost in the dead of night, a rupture loud as gods slapping the table. Everyone assumed it was judgment. Everyone assumed everything was judgment in those days. But in the morning, the crack turned out to be a line, and the line a seam, and the seam, once plugged with clay and straw and swear words, held better than any stonework before it. Sometimes, he concludes, the breaking is the making. He looks surprised at his own wisdom, then glares at anyone who noticed. You keep stalling. You think about the door at home, the latch you oiled in autumn, the wedge you cut in a hurry from the board that will now never be a spoon. You think about the ash you lifted like a quilt. You think about the blanket and the small feet that insist on colonizing your stomach at 3 a.m. You think about the dog, who understands heat as theology and keeps it enthusiastically. You think about the way your neighbor's hand found your elbow on the ice, neither admitting nor denying rescue. You think about cabbage and salt
and the discipline of putting away a bit of good to argue with a lot of bad. You think about saints and charms and which has more to do with the night not killing you. Answer is whichever one you remember fastest. The oven burps like a contented giant. The midwife announces the child and mother are both inclined to live. A cheer rises carefully in case joy might shatter air that is still a little brittle. The monk starts a hymn and everyone joins even though half the village prefers a different tune. Harmony is a luxury, volume will do. For a long, shameless minute, you all pretend this is what warmth means. The stone, the flame, the noise, the miracle of a roof with more names under it than there are saints to bless them. You could make a religion out of this. Perhaps you already have. And there it is, finally, the thing you were trying not to say because it is small and obvious, and therefore true enough to feel like theft. The secret to surviving the coldest night is not one thing. It is not a heroic fire, not a perfect blanket, not a saint with a very specific job description. It is not your courage, though that helps, and it is not your anger, though that helps in a different way. The secret is the ugly sum of 100 petty competences and a dozen shared habits. It is ash and clay and wedges and moss and soup and the proper handling of a poke and who you call first and how you arrange feet and which corner is for babies and which for old men. And what you refuse to tell fear because fear is a gossip. It is neighbors who know your cough and you knowing theirs. It is the oven you fed in summer paying you back in winter with interest compounded by memory. It is not beautiful. It is not noble. It is just the truth under wool. You hold the thought the way you would hold a coal, respectfully, with a clear plan for what to do with it. The man who knocked is asleep in a posture that can only be called forgiveness. His child breathes like a forge at rest. Your own are sprawled in every direction as if dreaming about cartography. The widow's youngest has attached itself to your leg as if you were a warmer species of furniture. The monk snores in Latin. The midwife eats with the sweat of victory on her face and refuses to look grateful. The oven glows. Outside, the night goes on being night, reduced by none of this and challenged by all of it. Eventually, because morning is a bureaucracy, someone suggests that beds in houses are superior to benches near bricks. The congregation of the oven considers this doctrine and finds it sound. Capes are reclaimed, children are stacked in their proper bundles, farewells are exchanged in the currency of nods. You step back into the lane, and the world has the indecency to be beautiful. Stars like holes punched into a warmer heaven, frost making lace on everything that agreed to be still, the kind of silence that is not absence, but praise. Your breath writes your name and then erases it. Your door feels your hand and cries itself open with a complaint that is actually relief. Inside, the hearth is exactly as you left it, because you taught it and it learned. You lay everyone down, you lay yourself down. The seam between sleeps is thin now. The second sleep comes like a verdict in your favor. Just before it lowers its heavy seal, you think one more uncharitable, comforting thought about the future. Someday, someone will turn a dial and command summer at midnight, and they will never know what it cost to coax heat from wood and stone and stubbornness. You forgive them in advance. You also envy them briefly and then pity them gently for the domestic theology they will never be forced to learn. The room narrows to wool, breath, ember. The oven dreams its own warm dream back in the square, radiating a lesson even to the stones that pretend not to be listening. Morning will come. The rooster will resume his astronomical error.
Morning pretends to arrive politely, But really it barges in, nudging the rim of the shutter with pale fingers as if light has keys to your door. You lie there and feel it touch your eyelids, not warm exactly, but nosy, the way a cousin stands too close at a feast. Your first thought is that you did it. Not we conquered winter, winter would laugh, but we outlasted one more of its teeth. The second thought is bread. The third is wood. The fourth is that you are thinking too fast for a day when fingers have not yet signed their employment contracts. So, you breathe. You listen. The house lists its small inventory of survival. A hearth that kept its promise. A door that kept out most of the wind. Children who learned how to dream in a straight line instead of a shiver. The rooster's opinions resume with the confidence of a man who was never corrected. You consider filing a complaint and decide to let mercy take the morning shift. The bucket cracks when you break the skin of ice. The same music as last night, but pitched for day. The spoon you left waiting is right where it should be. You chose its place last night with a half-sleeping brain and got it right, which feels like cheating the universe. Outside, the lane is quiet in the way that suggests it is thinking of mischief. Inside, straw rustles the way it always does, as if bedding has secrets to tell that are none of your business. You stand, and the room stands with you. The blanket slumps, hero off duty. Your breath hangs a moment, revising its contract with the air. At the hearth, you lift your ash quilt, and the coals glow like shy children agreeing to recite. A sliver, a breath, a small persuasion, and the flame rises as if it had been waiting to show off. Heat comes slow but sure, a local miracle. You are not moved to tears, you are moved to breakfast. That is how holiness works here. Practical, edible, mildly smoky. You think briefly of last night's oven, that red-hearted mouth in the square, a public promise made of brick. The memory warms you before the fire can. Faces collected there come back like sparks. The smith smaller than his hammer, the widow wider than her grief, the monk with his beeswax candle and his very sincere snore, the midwife with hands that could convince water to boil by reputation alone. You remember two cries, one of a child thawed back to this world, one of a child arriving for the first time, and how they place themselves in your chest like bookends. Everything between them has already begun to blur into something you call the night we survived together, which is not poetry so much as laziness. It takes too long to list every name. You chop bread that has the personality of a brick with opinions, and you love it more for that. A pot is nudged toward usefulness and pretends not to be pleased. The dog sits where heat will arrive soonest and takes credit for its punctuality. Your oldest pads past and steals the heel of bread as if you were not there. You let it happen because theft that greases a morning is the charity you can afford. The youngest sniffs the air and names breakfast like a monk names hours. Porridge, steam, maybe onion. Yes, onion. It is a feast. You smile like a rich person and are not rich. It is a trick you have practiced long enough to make honest. There is sweeping to do, always, because straw is creativity with low standards. The floor tells stories about last night's boots and this morning's opinions. You restore order just enough to offend chaos, not enough to insult it. The door is consulted and consents to open with a sound like advice. The lane peers in, approves your shoes, and tries to be an accident. You counter with deliberate steps. Your neighbor walks by, nods in the winter dialect that looks like a shrug and is not, and tells you with 3 words and a glance that the oven worked for everyone. You nod back and save the smile for later when the wind won't steal it. You scout the woodpile like a general with dignity and discover that your past self was thoughtful. There is enough. You add 2 sticks to the morning sentence and admire your own syntax. You think about the wedge in the door seam, the moss you bullied into diplomacy, the curtain you dragged across a gap and called design. Whole houses are those small decisions layered until they stand. Whole lives, too. You did not slay a dragon. You placed a stone. You banked ash. You moved a bed. You stirred a pot. You answered a knock. Winter hates that kind of heroism. It cannot argue with it. It can only demand repetition. Out in the field, the frost draws lines your plow will later obey. You try the ground with a boot, and it answers in a brittle syllable. Not today, it says, but soon. You ache for the work you will soon hate. That is one of the funnier jokes on earth. The sun has the gall to be faintly kind. Steam unspools from the byre like a flag. The cow pretends not to admire you and produces milk that forgives your worst decisions. Chickens commit to their little crimes with industry. You accept all of this as payment for duties you have not yet performed. Inside again, the children declare themselves hungry in every known language. You declare yourself a tyrant of bowls and begin ladling yes. Porridge can be a poem if you squint at it, but today it is simply obedience rendered edible. The baby smearing the future across its face with the self-confidence of a saint. Your spouse takes a breath that means last night is finally leaving their bones. You sit, you eat. Flavor is better than it deserves to be. You wrap your hands around the bowl because heat is a multi-tool. You are warm enough. For now. Enough is a banquet. The village rotates back into day life. The bell tries to sound casual and fails. Bells are born dramatic. Men inch toward the square with excuses and tools. Women exchange news like knitting patterns. Children orbit danger and are captured with bribes. The oven is closed to people again and reopened for bread. The door looks smug. On the green, someone has a complaint about hedges, as usual. On the lane, someone has a story about a fox, as usual. At the well, someone confesses they cried and pretended it was the wind, as usual. Usual is a blessing you don't name because naming blessings makes them skittish. You think, because morning invites the kind of thinking that gets in the way of shoveling, about how this would look from a high place. 1,000 houses, 1,000 small fires. The future will call it primitive, which is adorable. The future will have buttons that command entire climates. And sometimes it will push them and feel nothing. And sometimes it will push them and feel lonely. You would like to warn them that warmth is cheaper than company and much less effective. You would like to warn them that a good wedge and a good neighbor do more for a night than 100 lectures or one very expensive chair. You do not warn them, because they are not here. You warn your child instead to keep their scarf on. There is washing to do, and will always be washing. Water complains, your hands scold it. Soap is an event. The cloth squeaks in the way that admits progress. You hang things where smoke will mind them and complain into them and dry them anyway. Your body takes inventory. 10 fingers where you left them, a back that can still be persuaded, knees negotiating their contract. You laugh at yourself because otherwise you might be tempted to become important, and that would be exhausting. You make your rounds of tiny chores, each one a door into the same room, the room called tomorrow. The latch responds to oil like flattery. The hinge forgets to squeal. The pot develops an honest shine. The bed becomes an argument you plan to win again tonight. You rub a bit of beeswax on the draftiest beam because you like the smell and because sometimes smells are medicine. You check the winter chest where patience is stored. The salt nods at you. You nod back. The relationship remains professional. At noon, someone passes along a rumor wrapped in weather. A thaw is practicing in the next valley. A thin student with big ideas. Lunatics will walk on water thinking it is still glass and be corrected by physics. Your oxen will discover mud and call it art. Children will forget coats in lanes and have them rustled back onto shoulders by women famous for returning items to the correct place. You will miss the clarity of frost and then pretend you never said that. Afternoon shrinks again, as if time is pinching the day to see what falls out. You stack a fresh armful of kindling with the pride of a petty king. You mend a sleeve and catch yourself adding an unnecessary row of stitches because neatness is a small rebellion. The neighbor boy appears with cheeks that should be illegal and brings you a song he heard 2 lanes over, a tune made of 3 notes, and optimism. You hum it while stirring, which confuses the stew into tasting better. The world does not deserve this kind of magic, but it comes with the barley. Evening is back with its clipboard and its eyebrows, but the appointment is friendly. You lay the ritual out like cards, banking ash, drawing the curtain, setting the spoon where it belongs, placing the small socks where they can ambush small feet, choosing the patient log rather than the dramatic one. You do not expect drama, you expect duration. The wind mumbles at the shutter as if practicing last night's speech for a different audience. The door replies in its new polite voice. You are not smug, you are prepared.
And here is the part where a storyteller would wrap the thread in a bow, tug it tight, and present it as a moral. You are not a bow person. You prefer knots that can be untied in the dark with one hand. Still, we can pretend. If there is a lesson, and let us not insult winter by claiming to have learned one, maybe it's this. Comfort isn't a season that arrives. It's a craft you practice. The coldest nights do not end because the sun returns. They end because you repeat small competences until the dark is exhausted and lets you pass. Everything else is decoration. So, yes, the myth of medieval life full of glittering halls and roaring hearths has been returned to sender. Your hall roars when the wind misunderstands architecture. Your hearth murmurs like a shy friend doing their best. Your blankets are made of sheep that did not consent to the career change but perform with professionalism anyway. Your stew tastes like arithmetic, with occasional kisses of garlic when luck got drunk and stumbled into market. Your door is held closed by a wedge you made in a mood. And you, don't be modest, are a boring hero, the kind the world runs on. You kept the ash, you shared the heat, you answered the knock, you laughed before the laugh rose to the roof. If there is a place to rest, it is here, on the good, tired side of a hard night. The bed, disgraced and glorious, has the shape of you waiting for you. The room is the same room it has been since whoever built it guessed the wind and got it roughly right. The house breathes, the family breathes, even the dog breathes with a sense of legacy. You slip under wool that is forgiven you 1,000 times for having skin. You listen for the last argumentative sound and find none. The silence is not empty. It is a jar full of small victories. Before sleep dissolves the edges of things, you indulge one more modern comparison because it amuses you. Somewhere in the future, someone will whisper, "Alexa, set the thermostat to 72." And then they will check their phone and be outraged by nothing at all. You whisper, "Ash, do not betray me." And the ash obeys, and the flame wakes kindly, and your outrage finds nothing to do. Both of you will sleep. Only one of you will know what the house sounds like when it forgives you. Let the breath slow now. Let the story close the way good doors close, not with a slam, just a sure click. Let the field be a rumor until morning reminds it to be a fact. Let the saints do what saints do, and the charms do what charms do, and the moss keep its post. Let the oven keep dreaming warm dreams for people who may need them again soon. Let the wedge keep laws no council wrote. Let the frost write poems on the lintel and then erase itself by noon. You have earned this nothingness. And when tomorrow wakes you with its long list dressed as a rooster, you'll take the list and weigh it and laugh and do it anyway. Because you have a career in repetition. Because you have a union with your neighbors sealed by bread and ash. Because you have learned how to turn fear into chores and chores into heat. Because last night tested you and your answer was not elegant, but it was true. Because tonight will come again and you already know the lines. So close your eyes. Hear the house approve.
feel the weight of wool behave like a well-meaning friend draped over your shoulders. The cold is still outside rehearsing insults. Let it practice. Your part of the play is finished for now. Sleep. Not because the world is kind, but because you are. Sleep because tomorrow is a furnace that needs hands, and yours will arrive rested and sarcastic. Sleep because the stove learned your name, and the door learned manners, and the wind learned that you know where the wedge lives. Sleep because there is nothing left to prove, only heat left to share. And if all of this felt a little slow, a little damp, a little stubborn, good. That is the temperature of truth. The past does not sprint, it plods. It does not pose, it survives. You walked it with me, boots in mud, breaths in frost, hand on the latch, laugh in the pot. You were warmer now than when we began, even if only by the thickness of a story. That counts. That always counts. And yes, you can finally close your eyes. Because you did not conquer winter, you simply bored it into letting you sleep. Arguably, the most efficient victory plan in history.